Good afternoon, Britain. It's coming up to 12 o'clock on Friday, the 1st of March. So Keir Starmer has woken up this morning to the worst nightmare. Those are the words of a triumphant George Galloway as he stormed to victory in what's been described as a dark day for the Jewish community. How worried should Keir Starmer be? And what does this election say about the state of British politics? It's revealed the British taxpayer is set to pay at least £370 million to Rwanda and a further potential payment of £20,000 per person relocated. Is it time to call quits on this expensive and so far failed scheme? And 1 billion people worldwide are now obese, including 159 million children. Scientists claim the danger is now a greater threat than hunger. The World Health Organization says the food industry must be held accountable. But are bans and taxes the way to go? Right, well, please do keep your views coming in with your assessment of last night's by-election results. George Galloway, many people found his divisive form of politics utterly offensive, but he did storm to victory. Clearly, people aren't keen on voting for the main parties anymore. What do you think this says about the state of our democracy? Is this a one-off? Is this a one-off for the likes of George Galloway, or could this be replicated across the country come a general election? And what's Keir Starmer to do? Will he change his approach to Israel-Palestine, to the war in Gaza off the back of this result, or will he stick to what he's doing so far? Could there be further rebellions from within his party over this issue? Should any election in this country, any by-election, a local election, be centred around a foreign conflict that we are not directly involved in? What does that say too? And also, postal votes, a massive, massive increase in the proportion of postal votes in this by-election from the last election in Rochdale. What does that say? Does that worry you, or is it just easier for people to vote by post? Let me know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.com. But first, let's get your headlines with Sam Francis.
Emily, thanks very much. 12:02, and we start by recapping the top story of the day, that Labour has now apologised to voters in Rochdale for not putting up their own candidate. That's after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The returning MP, who Labour says will stoke fear and division, told crowds last night that his victory was for Gaza. During his career, the leader of the Workers' Party has also presented programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Well, taking to the stage last night, Mr Galloway again spoke of that conflict in Gaza.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price for the role that you have played in enabling, encouraging and covering for the catastrophe presently going on in occupied Palestine in the Gaza Strip.
We've been hearing from local residents in Rochdale about the result last night, and here's what they had to say.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time.
He played into the hands of the population, really, just to get into that position of power, really, to get that seat in Rochdale. I think he's done it selfishly just to get into government.
I'm just really disappointed. I mean, the man, he doesn't live here. This is the third political party he's managed to wangle himself into.
In other news, we've heard today that the cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million, plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant that's sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There'll also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated, with more than £150,000 per person over 5 years to cover ongoing costs. The government, though, insists the plan is vital, they say, to clamping down on illegal migration. Meanwhile, the former Borders and Immigration Inspector has said that the government made perverse decisions in its rush to clear the backlog of asylum seekers. David Neil was sacked last week amid a row over the quality of border checks. In a new report, he has now suggested that routine quality assurance has been sacrificed for what he called increased productivity. Neil the system to become what he calls a burning platform. In the last hour or so, we've heard the news that a man has been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge described as a ferocious and merciless attack on his former partner and her new boyfriend. 27-year-old Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett, who was 25, were killed by Marcus Osborne. The court heard that he waited for Miss Higton at the house they used to share before using her phone to lure her new partner to that address. He then continued his violent attack, raping another woman and holding her captive at the address. Miss Higton's mother has described her daughter's killer as a monster of the worst kind. To Moscow, where hundreds have gathered to bid farewell to the late Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. Crowds have been heard chanting his name as the coffin was carried into the church in the capital of Russia. Tight security, we understand, remains in place, with the Kremlin warning in the last few minutes that any unsanctioned gatherings there in support of Navalny will violate the law, they say. Mr. Navalny's allies have accused the Russian President Putin of killing his political rival, a claim that's been echoed by Britain and the US, among others. Here in the UK, MPs are set to consider a proposed law to ban LGBT conversion practices. The bill would impose unlimited fines on offenders who offer or advertise services to change a person's sexual orientation or to change a person to or from being transgender. It's the third time the long-delayed law has been considered by MPs, following pledges by former Prime Ministers Theresa May and Boris Johnson. And the cost of a postage stamp is going up again as Royal Mail raises prices amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class are also going up by the same amount, 10 pence to 85 pence a stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. The increases come after warnings by the troubled delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which it says is pushing up its costs. Those are the headlines. For more on all of those stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or of course go to our website, gbnews.com/.
Well, the Labour Party has apologised to the people of Rochdale for not fielding a candidate, as George Galloway swept to victory in last night's by-election with almost 40% of the vote, in a campaign which was mired in chaos and controversy. So Sir Keir Starmer has said Galloway only won because Labour did not stand after their candidate Azhar Ali was dropped for suggesting Israel was complicit in Hamas's October attack. Well, the former Labour and Respect MP, who now leads the Workers' Party of Britain, took fire at the Labour leader in his victory speech.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price.
Well, let's speak with GB News political editor Christopher Hope, who is in Rochdale for us. Christopher, he spelled it out there, George Galloway, didn't he? This is for Gaza.
That's right. Ironically, and hello, Emily. Ironic, of course, that the person who came second in this by-election, David Tully, was a hyper-local candidate campaigning on issues like the future of Rochdale FC and a new maternity wing for of a local hospital here. So the winner was internationalist, talked about Gaza, and this is for Gaza, not for people of Rochdale, George Galloway said. Second place was one looking at the narrow issues here in Rochdale. The two main parties in third and fourth place, Tories and Labour, and the Reform Party, which has been doing so well in the polls, up to 14% nationally at lunchtime, was fewer than 2,000 votes here. So completely upended the normal way you think about elections. No question George Galloway is going to make his mark in Parliament when he's sworn as an MP on Monday.
Yes, he says that Sir Keir Starmer has woken up to his worst nightmare with this result. How much impact do you think this will have? Clearly, George Galloway thinks that his movement, the fact that he's been elected, may have some bearing on the general election.
Yes, I mean, talking to people around George Galloway this morning here, they made very clear they think they can do kind of what the Reform Party is doing in some parts of the country to the Tory party, take away support, 2,000 or 3,000 votes in key seats. That could mean that the Labour don't win as many seats as they want to in some maybe Muslim, more Muslim population parts of the country. That could be what happens. So I think that's certainly where it might be going with the Workers' Party of Britain. They want to stand maybe 59, 60 or so candidates of the next election in targeted seats around the country, and that could be a problem for Keir Starmer. But the language here from George Galloway, he is someone who is very good with rhetoric. He said earlier this morning that Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are two cheeks of the same backside, and they both got well and truly spanked tonight here in Rochdale. This kind of language we're hearing more and more in Parliament. It's deeply uncomfortable for the Jewish community, for Jewish MPs. So far, the Labour Party has apologised that its candidate was dropped by the party because of his remarks he made about the October 7 attacks on Israel by Hamas. And the British Board of Deputies this lunchtime are saying that it's a dark day for the Jewish community to see George Galloway back in Parliament after nine years away from politics.
Yes, it's the same old divisive rhetoric from George Galloway. Another question that's come up is the question of postal votes. A large increase in the number of postal votes in this by-election as compared to the general election. What might explain that?
Well, we don't know why that happens. There's a common complaint from the parties like Reform and others that you see these big surges in postal votes because often those postal votes can be filled in by the head of the household. So the concern is that some people may have been forced to vote for different parties. We don't know the case, and it's been the case throughout for as long as I've been covering politics for 20 years. And certainly in the old days, UKIP and other parties would complain a lot about postal ballots being filled in. The government has tried to look at this and try to work out whether there's a problem here with people being forced to vote for different parties, but there's no evidence of that being found so far. But in this ballot, there does appear to be a high number of postal ballots so far, but so far the authorities are not saying anything about that at all, about whether that's a problem or not.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Christopher, our political editor there in Rochdale. So, how are the residents of Rochdale feeling about the chaotic by-election result and the campaign as well? Let's speak with GB News reporter Jack Carson, who's been with the voters. Jack, tell me, what are people feeling? How are they feeling after this controversial by-election?
Yeah, well, controversial, certainly, Emily, and a lot of people feeling quite unhappy this morning. Of course, turnout was much lower than considerably in this election, as it usually is with by-elections compared to the turnouts in general elections. Only 39.7% compared to the likes of 60 to 65% that turned out in 2019. But certainly a lot of people that have spoken to me this morning really unhappy that George Galloway has won this seat in this by-election, because, as Christopher was mentioning there, the kind of key point that even in his acceptance speech, making that this is for Gaza, that the people here in Rochdale, of course, the Independent got a lot of votes, coming second, beating the main parties. That maybe with a bigger turnout might well have been the winner, because the people here just don't feel that Galloway is necessarily prioritising the issues of Rochdale, prioritising, of course, the issues that they feel are important to them. But take a listen to what a few people told me a little bit earlier on.
I think it's an absolute disgrace. What's he going to do for Rochdale? I just don't know.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time.
So ashamed of being in Rochdale. Yeah, I'm just really disappointed.
And you've got Galloway, who's basically turned around and said that he'll only do stuff for Palestine, nothing about the people that live in Rochdale.
I can't think of anything that he's done for anybody else. So what the hell is he going to do for Rochdale?
I think he took advantage of the situation in Gaza and the very large Asian population.
Yeah, of course, there's been a lot of spotlight, hasn't there, over particular issues within this by-election. Labour's candidate, of course, Labour kind of went away from him, didn't it, after those anti-Semitic remarks. But, of course, really interesting speaking to the voters about whether reform was really an option for them. Some people just didn't feel that Simon Danjuk was the candidate for reform that they wanted to vote for. But as we've talked about in so many of these by-elections over the past few months, a lot of voters just feel disillusioned with the two main parties. They don't necessarily feel that Keir Starmer fully yet is convincing enough to represent them. They certainly don't feel that the Conservatives, of course, with the current government are anywhere near near enough supporting them in their local issues as well. Of course, the Conservatives came third and Labour fourth in this election. But the election of Galloway himself, of course, we've heard, haven't we, from the Board of Deputies of British Jews saying that this is a dark day for the UK Jewish community. Their spokesperson saying that they believe that Galloway is a conspiracy theorist who's brought the politics of division and hate to every place they say he has ever stood for Parliament. Galloway himself accusing Labour of effectively facilitating, he says, the genocide in Gaza. But Labour's Deputy National Camp Coordinator this morning saying that they've set out very clearly their position in Gaza, as adopted, of course, as we saw with the problems in the Commons last week with that amendment. They believe that there should be immediate humanitarian ceasefire and, of course, more aid going in, and they are against that ground offensive that Netanyahu is wanting to do in Rafah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jack Carson there, our GB News reporter. Very interesting to hear what people on the ground actually make of this result. And I wonder how many of them actually went out to vote. It wasn't a very high turnout. But let's now speak with Manchester-based Labour MP Graham Stringer. Graham, thank you very much indeed for joining me. George Galloway says Sir Keir Starmer has woken up to his worst nightmare after the result last night. A damning night for your party.
Well, in effect, the Labour Party didn't have a candidate that we were supporting. It's not a damning night for the Labour Party. It's a very bad night for Rochdale. They're now represented by the country's leading carpetbagger, who has represented, I think, 4 constituencies. None of those constituencies have gained from having him as the MP. His attendance in the House of Commons is not great when he has been an MP in the past. He's basically part of a political circus. He will be moved out of Rochdale at the next general election.
But the issue of Gaza and the war in Gaza isn't going to go anywhere quickly by the looks of things. Could this not impact at the general election? What does Sir Keir Starmer do now? Does he change his position? Does he stay where he is? What does he do? Because we could see independents with a similar stance as George Galloway campaigning in the future in different constituencies.
I think the thing about George Galloway is he's unique. I can't think of anybody else who has fought such aggressive, divisive campaigns in so many constituencies. And of course, he's not always won when he's campaigned. I think what the Labour Party has to do is be very clear on its policy in Gaza and the Middle East and elsewhere. I mean, the majority of people in Rochdale think that Rochdale is the priority, and looking after a town that has suffered from nearly a third in cuts to public services delivered by the local authority. It's suffered from a lot of social problems. That's what the Labour Party candidate, when he or she is chosen for the next general election, will be focusing on. Internationally, the Labour Party obviously has to take the principled position. We all want the killing to stop in Gaza, but not at the expense of the defence of Israel. Israel has a right to defend themselves, and not at the expense of the Palestinians living in Gaza. There has to be an agreed ceasefire by both sides, with the prisoners the hostages, not prisoners, given back to Israel, and Israel will give back prisoners. That's the solution to this, not which Galloway does, supporting the one party in this this whole mess in the Middle East, Hamas, who actually their official policy is for genocide. So that has to be Labour's position, a principled position, looking for peace, not supporting a genocidal policy which Galloway does.
Yes, Graham, we heard there from a number of local residents in Rochdale, very unhappy with the result, some of them. Was the election campaigned on local issues? Lots of people concerned that this election, simply on the basis of what's happening in a foreign conflict.
Well, I think that's right. I think the Labour Party chose a candidate that we couldn't continue to support because he'd made some anti-Semitic, racist comments. So did the Greens. The Conservatives, as I understand it, weren't happy with their candidate. It was a very strange general election, which didn't do democracy any favours at all. And one of the good things is we can put that right in the general election when it comes later this year, and I have no doubt that the Labour Party will be very careful and we will choose the best possible candidate that we can, who will focus on the problems that Rochdale have got. As I said, Rochdale Council, like many Labour-run councils in the north of England, has suffered nearly a third cut in its grants from central government. That's where we need to campaign on the things that are important to Rochdale. They've not had the best policing over the last 20 years that they could have had. There have been problems with closures of part of the health service. Those are what a good Labour candidate will focus on in the general election.
And Graham, just quickly, just lastly, should we be concerned about the increase in postal votes? It's quite marked.
There has been a lot of discussion in Parliament this year. There's been a change in the regulations that apply to voting, so that you now have to go with a photo ID when you vote. I think there is a real gap in the security of elections around postal votes. So having looked at one side of the issue, I think we need to take a serious look at the security and integrity of the postal vote system.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you, Graham Stringer, Labour MP. Great to speak to you. Now, coming up, a watchdog warns the cost of the Prime Minister's troubled Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million. I'll have the very latest with our security editor after this short break. Stay with us. This is Good Afternoon Britain.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
to find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
You have a president in President Biden who's not enforcing the law that was passed by Congress. President Obama, criticize him or not, actually enforced the law and was deporting people that had crossed illegally. Of course, President Trump enforced the law and improved the law to make sure that and worked with Mexico to have the Remain in Mexico policy. Biden has abandoned federal policy. In fact, he's deliberately trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has broken the contract between the United States and the state of Texas. And the eye numbers, Greg, are simply eye-watering. 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years, Governor Abbott says. That's more than the population of 33 states in the United States. Astonishing numbers.
And Martin, that's just Texas. If you add Arizona and other border states, you know, it's pushing 10 million. By the end of Biden's term, it'll be 11 million. A study by Yale University a few weeks ago, 3 very liberal professors that did the study estimate there's 22 million illegal aliens. So this is a crisis that was created by Biden. It's what he wants. They want unfettered access to the border. They're letting them in. It's a real hardship on the working people of Texas and other border states. And now it's a real hardship on cities that the federal government, as well as the governors of Texas and other states, are sending some of the migrants to those so-called sanctuary cities.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 12:25. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. We'll be getting to some of your views on George Galloway's win last night. But first, the cost of Rishi Sunak's troubled Rwanda asylum scheme could soar to £500 million. However, the Home Office has so far refused to say how much more it'll cost on top of the $300 million already confirmed. But a National Audit Office report has revealed that a whopping £150 million has been earmarked for the partnership with Rwanda over the next 3 years. And that includes a price tag of £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There's also a boost of £120 million once the first 300 migrants have been relocated to Rwanda. By the end of the year, the Home Office will have incurred direct costs of £28 million to establish the agreement, including set-up charges for escorting migrants on the one-way trip and training facilities, legal fees and staff. Well, joining me to discuss this is GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White. These numbers are eye-watering.
Yes, I mean, it's certainly stark when the National Audit Office is kind enough to add up all these figures for us. We always knew that the upfront costs of the Rwanda partnership were significant, 290 million that the government has told us about already. As you said in the introduction there, they have not gone into what the recurring costs are likely to be over the length of this scheme. That's what the National Audit Office has done here and calculated that it's around about £500 million. And of course, there have been extrapolations that have taken place, putting that cost at about £2 million for each asylum seeker that's sent to Rwanda. I'm not sure that that is particularly helpful as a figure, though, to be honest, because that 300 figure, we just don't know what the actual total number of those who go to Rwanda will be if that scheme ever gets off the ground. And clearly, the more people that go, then the unit cost of sending them down in terms of the totality of the cost of the scheme would reduce a bit. But it is, having said that, Emily, still a very significant cost to the taxpayer.
Yes, we're going to be discussing later on in the show if, considering this huge cost, whether it's time for the government to call quits on the scheme. But in your view, Mark, could this scheme still work? Because, of course, it's very frustrating that nothing so far has happened.
I think if this scheme had got off the ground, Emily, when it was first announced by Boris Johnson in April of 2022, there's a very good chance that it would have made a very significant impact on the numbers coming across the channel, because I was in France speaking to migrants across the other side of the channel in the weeks and months after the policy was announced. And there was a great deal of concern about how they would be impacted by that policy at that time. but it's dragged on month after month now, coming up to 2 years, and nothing has happened. They look upon it over the other side of the channel, and certainly amongst the people smugglers, as all a bit of a joke. And if it did get off the ground, I think they would have to really be committed to sending quite substantial numbers over to Rwanda for those migrants and the people smugglers to get the idea that there is actually quite a high chance that if you come over the channel, then you stand a significant chance of going to Rwanda. If it's just a few hundred or 1,000 or two in the end who are sent, then the actual deterrent effect would probably be minimal, I would guess.
And I'm reading here that we'll also be forking out for accommodation, food and education, possibly for years to come, even if these migrants are taken over to Rwanda. Saying here the UK government would also provide up to £150,000 per person to cover accommodation, food and education. How long is the British taxpayer on the hook if and when migrants are actually deported to Rwanda?
Well, you're right there, absolutely. But I think the important thing to get into perspective with regard to that cost per asylum seeker who's being sent there, and I think it adds up to about £170,000 in terms of keeping them in their accommodation, providing all of the wraparound services that they would need as well. That, we understand, is about 5 years of the scheme, and then they would be expected to have been through the system, granted asylum by that time, and being integrated into society in Rwanda. So from that point on, we wouldn't be paying them. And I think the important thing to probably remember the government would emphasise with regard to that £170,000 per migrant per year is that actually it's pretty much a similar price to what you would pay to have an asylum seeker here in the UK in our hotels with all the wraparound services that they get here in the UK before eventually the asylum application is granted or otherwise, and then they're, you know, absorbed into the sort of wider economy.
Well, there you go. It's all relative. Thank you very much, Mark White, GB News Home and Security Editor, for bringing us the very latest on the cost of the Rwanda scheme. Now, coming up, I'll be reading some of your views on George Galloway. I've got them here. His win at the Rochdale by-election by almost 6,000 votes. Quite a few of you have got a strong view on the older postal votes. We'll get to those after your latest headlines.
Emily, thank you very much. At 12:30, the headlines this hour. Labour has apologised to voters in Rochdale for not putting up their own candidate after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The returning MP, who Labour says will stoke fear and division, told crowds that his victory was for Gaza. During his career, the leader of the Workers' Party has also presented programmes on TV for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. A man has been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge described as a ferocious and merciless attack. The court heard that Marcus Osborne waited for his former partner at their old home and also lured her new partner to that address. Miss Higton's mother has described her daughter's killer as a monster of the worst kind. The cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million, plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant that's sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. The government, though, insists the plan is vital, they say, to clamping down on illegal migration. And in Moscow, hundreds of people have gathered to bid farewell to the late Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. Crowds have been heard chanting his name as the coffin was carried into that church. Tight security remains in place, with the Kremlin also warning that any unsanctioned gatherings, as they've described them, in support of Navalny will violate the law, they say. Mr. Navalny's allies have also accused the president of Russia of killing his political rival, a claim echoed by Britain, the US and many others. Those are the headlines. For more, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
We had Grant Shapps on last week. He was talking about how defence spending is now creeping up to 2.25% of GDP. Ben Wallace's predecessor suggested it should be 3%. We hear that we've got the smallest army, I think, since the Napoleonic Wars. Numbers are down. There's a question as to whether we can staff frigates in the Red Sea. Why haven't we sent aircraft carriers? What's your impression of the situation?
Well, I don't think it matters how much you spend, it's how effectively you spend it. And we spend it very ineffectively. We have lots of scandals about defence spending. And I think partly because of the monopoly position of some of our defence suppliers, we don't get good value and we don't get reliability. This latest story in the Telegraph is that HMS Diamond, which is our ship, which is out there defending the Red Sea, doesn't have the capability of firing a missile from the ship to the land, so it can't participate in the attacks on the Houthis. So in order that we can participate in the attacks, we're flying RAF aircraft from Cyprus, which is a very long way away. When I was Defence Secretary, I ordered cruise missiles for our nuclear-powered, but not nuclear-armed submarines. And I think we have 6 or possibly 7 of those. But last autumn, it was reported that 5 of those were out of commission, were not available. We have about 21 aggressive surface ships. So we've got 2 aircraft carriers, then we've got frigates, and we've got destroyers. But at any one time, you can count on about half of those not being available because they're under refit or whatever. So we have a minimal surface fleet now. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem that we're able to deploy a submarine to the area that can fire cruise missiles. Our 2 aircraft carriers, built at enormous expense, are sitting in Portsmouth.
Which seems to most people ludicrous,
well,
at least with what's going on.
It doesn't seem ludicrous to me.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Right, well, as promised, I'm going to get to some of your views on by-election result. Jane says, I'm frightened for all of the North West after the results of Rochdale by-election. She doesn't explain why, but I think I've got a good idea. David says George Galloway wants to be an MP for George Galloway, not for Rochdale. Well, David, you're not the only one to suggest that. Narcissism has come up quite a lot. Bill, postal voting must be banned, except for disabled people, as it's too open to abuse and fraud. Yes, a lot of people get a bit queasy when we discuss postal votes. Some people suggesting, oh, nothing untoward's happened, you don't have any evidence, blah, 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 blah. But I think it is a fair enough question. Ask why has the number of postal votes as a proportion of votes cast risen so sharply? Peter says postal votes need to be scrapped. They're open to corruption. People should present themselves at the polling station and vetted properly. Well, that's what Graham Stringer was essentially saying earlier, the Labour MP. Up in the northwest, he was saying that, yes, there probably should be some kind of review. I don't think he used the word investigation, but something along those lines anyway. Barbara says, I hope the people who caused the low turnout aren't complaining. If they wanted someone other than Galloway, they had the chance. I feel sorry for those who voted to try and keep him out. It's stupid to vote only with Gaza in mind. Well, yes, the turnout was quite low. So if you had decided not to venture out to the polling station and you're not a fan of George Galloway, I guess you only have yourself to blame. But I guess it shows, too, that people are fed up with politics as it is and they didn't perhaps see a candidate that spoke to them. But we can now speak with GB News political correspondent Olivia Rutley. Olivia, a result that many people will be deeply upset about, unhappy about. What will George Galloway be like as an MP?
Well, already the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Board of Deputies, has said that this is a terrible result for British Jews. They are deeply worried about anti-Semitism rising in the UK as a result of the election of George Galloway. Previously, when George Galloway has stood as an MP, there have been accusations, as you said there, Emily, of narcissism, that Galloway is simply standing for whatever will further his own career rather than standing for the people of Rochdale. Sajid Javid, the former Chancellor, who is from Rochdale, has tweeted saying that this is an awful result for the people of Rochdale. He remarks that turnout is low. Well, yes, that's true, but it wasn't actually as low as some predicted. There's also an interesting question, of course, about what this means for both the Labour and the Conservative parties. Now, there are pollsters and aides close to the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who say that actually Keir Starmer will be able to shrug this off pretty easily. And actually, the fact that Labour's own campaign imploded might not have been such a bad thing for Labour. If Labour had lost to George Galloway rather than just not standing against George Galloway, it would have been far more embarrassing than this situation for Keir Starmer, where he can just sort of brush it off. As for the Conservatives, it was a pretty bad night for them as well. Of course, no one was expecting them to win Rochdale, but actually their support just went down, even though support for the Reform Party was lower than support for the Brexit Party in 2019. Of course, the potential issue for Starmer is that the Rochdale by-election, you could argue, proves that there is a constituent of people in the UK who are prepared to vote in a general election purely on the issue of Gaza. Keir Starmer has clearly taken a pretty robust pro-Israel line. But the thing is, for the Conservatives, that is a weakness of Keir Starmer's, that they can't really exploit. The Conservatives' line on Israel, if anything, is stronger than Labour's. It'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out at a general election. Ultimately, the situation in Rochdale was so unusual, so colourful. Almost every single party was affected by some sort of scandal. It's very difficult to sort of extrapolate this result onto a general election. But the main takeaway is, it is a very bad day indeed for Jews in the UK and anyone else, most people who are worried about the rise in anti-Semitism. And B, it was a bad night for both of the main parties.
For, I guess, the people of Rochdale, who don't want to see a man like George Galloway as their representative, but again, turnout was quite low. Do they have themselves to blame, or perhaps does this just show that people have apathy and they don't feel they have someone to vote for?
There is certainly an issue with voter apathy. In all of the last by-elections, we have seen a pretty low turnout. I think that it's tough in this specific situation to blame the people of Rochdale for not turning out. It was a pretty appalling lineup of candidates. The Green Party had to withdraw their support for their candidate. Obviously, the Labour campaign completely imploded. Simon Danjuk, the Reform candidate, is a pretty controversial figure too. He was he left the Labour Party under a cloud a couple of years ago. So there wasn't really a great option on that ballot paper. And as you say, turnout, it was low. It will ultimately be the people of Rochdale who will probably end up suffering from this. Just under 40% of those who did turn out voted for George Galloway, which obviously means that the majority of those in Rochdale did not vote for George Galloway in this by-election. It will be them who suffer with Galloway as their representative in Parliament. If you look at the campaign material that Galloway sent out, it shows just what a divisive figure he is to Muslim areas. When he was leafleting in Muslim areas, he wrote a pamphlet saying that he would be supportive of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, that he said that this was an election that he was fighting on the issue of Gaza alone. Meanwhile, when he was writing leaflets for the white working class areas of Rochdale, he was talking about how he knows what a woman is, an idea which appeals on the whole to sort of small c conservatives. he was there to get what he wanted out of this election, and the people of Rochdale will suffer as a result.
Yes, it is quite something that his campaign literature was just so different, so differently phrased. This is for Gaza for some residents, and then, no, I'm all about the local issues of Rochdale to other residents, depending on who they are, what demographic they come from. But of course, other politicians in the past have done similar, have been accused of similar anyway. But just lastly, the issue of corruption has been talked about by the Reform Party in particular. There have been questions over the significant rise in the use of postal votes. Graham Stringer, we spoke to earlier, he seems to have some problems with postal votes as well, thinking perhaps there needs to be some kind of review there.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting comment from Graham Stringer from Labour. There is often a little bit of unease around the high quantity of postal votes in by-elections, but usually the main parties shy away from suggesting that there might be a problem with corruption. Obviously, if there is a corruption of the postal vote system, then that would be seriously undermining the UK democracy. It'll be really interesting to see if anything is done about that as we head towards a general election. Of course, now voters have to bring ID with them to the polling station, something which was only introduced in the last year, I think it was. Will something similar be done to crack down on potentially corrupt postal votes? Again, though, it is very, very difficult to extrapolate this result or anything that happened in this by-election onto a general election in general, as well as all of the issues that we've talked about. There were lots of local issues at play in this Rochdale by-election. There was a lot of concern about the lack of a maternity hospital in Rochdale. That was one issue, a very localised issue, which people were voting on. So it is really, really difficult to try and learn anything, really, from this by-election, apart from the fact that it was clearly not a good night for Labour. We knew it was going to be a bad night for Labour ever since their campaign imploded a few weeks ago, and it was a bad night for the Tories too.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Olivia Utley there, our political correspondent live from Westminster. Now, coming up, I'm going to get some more of your views on the postal voting, why you think turnout was so low and what you think a George Galloway win means for Rochdale and this country, but also over 1 billion people worldwide are obese. How did we get here? Do we need to tax and ban our way out of obesity? I'll be asking that question after this short break.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
The EU rules are trying to choke even that.
Yeah.
And I just think, I would join this protest in a heartbeat. And you are right to point out this stuff about them being right-wing. How dare they slate them as right-wing when these are real people whose livelihoods are
remember,
being
a lot of
trashed.
people who work in the farm industry, Malone, get paid very little money.
They get paid,
Agricultural workers are very badly paid.
They get paid nothing, Piers. And, the profits... I think on Clarkins Farm I read somewhere that I saw that when you sell it like a sheep's skin, it's 30 pence or something.
Right.
And you say, what?
Yeah.
And so you wonder how they can manage that. And I think after a year, Clarkson made a handful of pounds.
He made like 90 quid profit or something.
In a whole year working.
But Carol makes a really good point, though, doesn't she, Nikki, about this idea that we go to the supermarkets, we shop there, we eat our food, we don't often give it a thing. And the farmers have become so frustrated by this idea that they are not respected.
Absolutely. I mean, they're running what are effectively small businesses, often family businesses that have been passed down through generations. They also tend to know the land and the animals better than anyone else in those areas. I am all for green protesting, I'm all for climate change activism, but actually The only way you can do that is gradually. It's exactly what we've seen with Port Talbot. You know, you can't just go in and say you're not going to do it anymore this way. You've got to do it this way instead. The Tata Steel thing. Yes, exactly. Yeah. You've got to do it this way instead. You know, lots of farmers are on board with protecting the planet, but they can't do it overnight. You've got to give them time.
Yeah.
So they're protesting. You know, they're saying no farmers, no food.
When
well,
you say
can't
you
get any more
support
obvious.
some of these environmental protests, you're not one of these closet supporters of Just Stop Oil, are you?
I'm not a closet supporter. I think I've been quite open about Just Stop Oil.
No.
I don't like all their methods, but I do like the message.
Any of them.
But I do appreciate the message. Yeah, but sometimes you've got to do difficult things.
What they're asking for now, those protesters, are unrealistic. What these protesters are asking for is not unrealistic.
No.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together. For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Well, let's turn to some other news other than the Rochdale by-election, because shocking new analysis reveals there are now more than 1 billion obese people worldwide, with 1 in 8 of the population affected. Now, around 159 million children, 879 million adults have a weight that is so high relative to their height that it classifies them as obese, with rates among youngsters quadrupling globally between 1990 and 2022. Rates among adults more than doubled. So let's break down the figures and ask why we have such a global issue with our weight. It's worse for our health, apparently, as a world population than malnutrition and hunger. So I'm joined by the former presenter of Fat Families, Steve Miller. Steve, thank you very much for joining me. Now, when we hear startling statistics like this, we often hear straight from the public health lobby, we need to tax more, we need to ban more, and this is all down to the food industry. Is that right?
No, absolute chubby cobblers to that one. You know, and the last thing we want to be doing in a cost of living crisis is taxing people more, banning everything, and so forth. And, you know, you think about it, why should the responsible pay for people that are irresponsible? What we actually need in the UK is a form of behaviour change. We need to facilitate behaviour change. And what I mean by that is getting away from all of this culture that we've got, where, you know, it's really cool to be fat and show off your curves, and what really means is a euphemism for fat. And we need to encourage and motivate people to take responsibility. Now, unfortunately, that sometimes means that you've got to be cruel to be kind in terms of intervention and messaging. So we've got to get away from this. You know, when anyone talks about anything to do with encouraging people to own their body better, we've got to get away from this ridiculous term, fat shaming. Everyone to, you know, oh, you can't talk about that. It's wrong to talk about it. Well, we got a decision to make, haven't we, in this country? On one hand, listen, we either take it seriously and do something about it without fear of upsetting a few people, or we just shut up moaning and let everyone get fatter and let it cost us all a lot of money and all await a chubby coffin.
Steve, you say that some people are trying to make fat cool, trying to make being fat cool, I should say. You know, there are body positive influencers out there. There are people on TikTok who like to show off their curves, as they say. Do you think that actually has made it cool, though, or is it just them trying to make themselves feel a bit better? I don't think anyone actually aspires to be obese, do they really?
No, I don't think people sit at home saying, oh, yippee, yippee, I can't wait to shove donuts in my mouth and get really fat like everyone else. What it has done, though, is it's created a denial, a psychological denial, where people do sit at home thinking to themselves, oh, well, it doesn't matter. And there's no societal pressure, motivational pressure on people. And it's not about being cruel, but there's no motivational pressure on people to own responsibility, take responsibility. Now, and also what we've got, you see, not just in this country, but around the world, is you've got lots of bodies in terms of organisational bodies that, you know, they talk a lot, they strategise a lot, they have loads of policies, but they don't actually do anything. Mostly in this country, they don't do anything because they're too fit. Everyone's worried about upsetting people.
It does seem Like the proposals, the recommendations that come from the health lobby are always to do with making the cost of junk food more or banning certain adverts. And I do wonder whether that actually has an impact in practice. But do you believe the headline here that obesity is now the greater health risk than hunger? I mean, surely in some ways that's a sign of progress. We've got an abundance of food. People who used to be starving now may be a bit chubby.
Well, I think what we've got, listen, we've got an access to the chubby feeding food, so much of it now because it's so cheap. And I know people say, oh, it costs too much to eat healthy. Well, I'm afraid that is also cobblers, because if you look deeply, you can eat healthily on a budget. However, what the government could do, practical measure rather than theory, is partner with the supermarkets so that when people enter the supermarket, they have got the solution to eat healthy, i.e. the cost-effective healthy solutions. That isn't happening. But we do need to get tougher. And what I mean by that, another practical measure, yes, if you're too fat, you pay for 2 seats on a plane. If you're too fat...
No, Steve, that's where you go too far. That's where you go too far. You can't do that.
Well,
and we can't weigh people like cattle either before they go onto a plane. Absolutely not, Steve.
See, you're doing... Emily, as much as I love you to bits, listen, you're doing exactly what the nation is doing. Oh, my goodness, no, that's too hard, that's too nasty. Listen, we're either going to deal with it and upset a few people on the way, or we're
Steve, I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to cut you off there mid-flow because we've come to the end of the hour, but always great to speak to you, Steve Miller there. Now, coming up, we'll be hearing from the Prime Minister on the George Galloway win in that Rochdale by-election. Stay with us.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. The rest of the day will remain cold wherever you are. There's a further risk of rain, showers and some hill snow. Got low pressure still in charge. That's got cold air wrapped around it as well as these occluded fronts. And that's where the focus for the most persistent rain will continue to be. That area will push into more southern areas of Scotland through this evening and then into northern Scotland later on tonight. So we could see snow falling above around 150 to 200 metres. Further south, it should stay drier for a time this evening, but overnight this more persistent area of rain will push in to the south coast and then up towards the Midlands. That brings a risk of snow to some lower levels by tomorrow morning. So it will be a cold start to the weekend wherever you are, and it will remain quite overcast and wet through much of the day for central areas of England as well as northern areas of England later on by mid-morning. Further south and west, we'll see a mix of sunshine and showers, but those showers bring a risk of heavy downpours as well as some hail and further hill snow. So another quite unsettled and cold feeling day to come through tomorrow. Sunday is looking much drier on the whole. There's still a risk of showers, particularly across the south as well as the far north, but many areas should see a much drier day with a greater chance of some sunshine. And it won't feel too bad in the sunshine. We are now into meteorological spring, but there is some further rain to move into the southwest later on Monday. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World. Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yep.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, you know, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offender behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Carson, this Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 1 o'clock on Friday, the 1st of March. So Keir Starmer has woken up this morning to his worst nightmare. Those are the words of a triumphant George Galloway as he stormed to victory in what's been described as a dark day for the Jewish community. How worried should Keir Starmer be, and what does this election say about the state of British politics? We'll be hearing from the Prime Minister very shortly. And we'll also be crossing to Rochdale for all the very latest reaction, including from the residents themselves, as to whether they think their new MP cares more about Gaza or his own constituency. And it's revealed the British taxpayer is set to pay at least £370 million to Rwanda and a further potential payment of £20,000 per person relocated. Is it time to call quits on this expensive and so far failed scheme? We'll have the debate. Well, Ken certainly thinks elections in this country should focus on local issues. He says, could someone remind Galloway that we are not in Gaza, we are in Britain, and therefore we vote on British issues and not something that has nothing to do with us. The problem is, Ken, though, that clearly there are a lot of people who care about it massively in that constituency, and arguably that is democracy. But George Galloway does very much make the most of divisions in our country. Sectarian politics, some have called it, including our Nigel Farage here on GB News. Very worrying precedent. Will it have ramifications for the general election? What will Sir Keir Starmer do? Are you concerned about the rise in postal votes? Some have suggested maybe there might be a bit of corruption there, a little bit of intimidation. People have spoken about, people have said this is one of the most divisive and messy elections ever. Let me know what you think. GBviews at gbnews.com. Bill says postal voting must be banned, except for disabled people. Do you agree with Bill? Or do you think for some people it's actually easier and encourages more people to actually vote, which could be, you know, a good thing, mostly because turnout was pretty low? And why do you suspect the turnout was quite so low? Do you think it's because people just simply did not see a candidate for them to vote for? There weren't many good options, were there? You had Azhar Ali, of course, that the Labour Party disowned, and George Galloway storming to victory. Let me know what you think. GBviews at gbnews.com. But first, it's your news.
Emily, thanks very much and good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's just coming up to 2 minutes past 1 and we start with the top story of the day. That Rishi Sunak has now said the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times. That's after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has also described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who they say brings division and hate to every place he has ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Well, taking to the stage last night, Mr Galloway said his victory was for Gaza.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price for the role that you have played in enabling, encouraging and covering for the catastrophe presently going on in occupied Palestine in the Gaza Strip.
Last night's vote saw a sharp rise in postal votes, though there's been no evidence, we understand, of any irregularities. GB News spoke to local residents in Rochdale following that result, and here's what they had to say.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time.
He played into the hands of the population, really, just to get into that position of power, really, to get that seat in Rochdale. I think he's done it selfishly just to get into government.
I'm just really disappointed. I mean, the man, he doesn't live here. This is the third political party he's managed to wangle himself into.
As we've been hearing, the cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million. That's plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant that's been sent to the African nation. Well, an investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There'll also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated there, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs over 5 years. The Prime Minister, though, says the plan is vital to clamping down on illegal migration.
Taxpayers are already forking out millions of pounds a day to house illegal migrants in hotels across the country. That's not right, and that's why I made stopping the boats one of my priorities. I'm pleased that we've made progress. Last year the numbers were down by a third. That never happened before, shows that the plans are working. But in order to fully resolve this issue, we need to have a deterrent. We need to be able to say, if you come here illegally, you won't be able to stay. We can remove you to a safe country. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important. It's the worthwhile investment, and I'm determined to see it through.
Meanwhile, the former Borders and Immigration Inspector has said that the government made perverse decisions in its rush to clear the backlog of asylum seekers. David Neal was sacked last week amid a row over the quality of border checks. In a new report, he suggests that routine quality assurance has been sacrificed for, he says, increased productivity. Neal blames the Home Office for allowing the asylum system to become what he calls a burning platform. A man has today been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge described as a ferocious and merciless attack on his former partner and her new boyfriend. 27-year-old Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett, who was 25, were killed by Marcus Osborne. The court heard that he waited for Miss Higton at the house they used to share before using her phone to lure her new partner to that address. He then continued his violent attack, raping another woman and holding her captive at that home. Well, to Moscow, where hundreds have gathered this morning to bid farewell to the late Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. Crowds have been seen and heard chanting his name as the coffin was carried into the church in the capital of Russia. The Kremlin has warned, though, that any unsanctioned gatherings, as they've called them, in support of Navalny would violate the law. Mr Navalny's allies have accused the Russian president of killing his political rival, a claim that's been echoed by Britain, the EU, the US and many others. The cost of postage stamps are going up as the Royal Mail rises prices yet again amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class stamps are also going up by the same amount, that's 10 pence, to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence, but the increase comes after warnings by the troubled delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which they say is pushing up its costs. Those are the latest headlines from the GB Newsroom for now. For more, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Now, the Labour Party has apologised to the people of Rochdale for not fielding a candidate as George Galloway swept to victory in last night's by-election with almost 40% of the vote in a campaign which was mired in chaos and controversy. Sir Keir Starmer has said Galloway only won because Labour did not stand after their candidate Azhar Ali was dropped for suggesting Israel was complicit in Hamas's October attack. And now we can hear from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for his reaction to Galloway's victory.
Well, it was very concerning to see the reports of intimidation through the by-election, and by all accounts, one of the most divisive campaigns that we've seen in recent times. You know, I'm pleased that the Conservative Party was the only party to run a really positive campaign focused on local issues with a great local candidate in Paul Ellison, and well, that's where we are.
Did you welcome him back?
As I said, I'm pleased that the Conservative Party ran a positive campaign focused on local issues.
Well, Rishi Sunak said they focused on a positive campaign, focused on local issues. So let's speak with GB News political editor Christopher Hope, who is in Rochdale for us now. So we just heard from the Prime Minister. He said it was a very divisive campaign, but that the Conservative candidate ran on local elections that matter, local issues that matter.
Yes, I mean, the PM, he got a good third place. Paul Ellison turned from 4,000 votes. But the real local candidate here was David Tully, the independent candidate, who, of course, fighting for a new maternity wing in a local hospital here, fighting for Rochdale FC. He was second behind George Galloway, who won with a 6,000 or so majority. There's no question that this by-election will go down in political history as the one where George Galloway staged his political comeback after 9 years out of frontline politics, and where it leaves and where it takes MPs next week when he gets back, take his seat on the green bench in the Commons is anyone's guess. Right now, Jewish groups are saying that MPs should shun him when he goes there. He might use his position on the backbenches to try and make points, try and inflame tensions about Gaza. And we saw how difficult that was to manage for Keir Starmer in that key debate in the Commons 10 days ago or so ago. So I think it is a whole new chapter in our political life looking forward into that. I thought that the Reform Party would be very disappointed with their 6th place, fewer than 2,000 votes, claims of dirty tricks and the like, but still a very poor showing. Talking to their team, the problem they had was they didn't have the same kind of number of people on the ground as they had in Wellingborough. Their party conference drew staff away to Doncaster last week. But I think fewer than 2,000 is a problem. Despite that, though, this lunchtime, they're right up to 14 points in the polls with YouGov. So they are doing well nationally, but yet again, this party is a protest party, does well on social media, but can't deliver votes on the ground. That's its problem.
Now, George Galloway fought his campaign in a similar way to how he has done in the past. Remind us of some of his tactics.
Yeah, he focused entirely on the issue of Gaza. When he won last night, he declared that this is a win for Gaza, not for the people of Rochdale. That was extraordinary. He talked about Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak being the two cheeks on the same bottom, and they were slapped roundly by the people of Rochdale. He focused entirely, really, mainly on the Muslim community, concerned a lot about Gaza and about the Israel's war there against Hamas, and that's how he won. I mean, he's been a divisive politician as long as he's been in politics, basically. He was a Labour politician. He was kicked out of the party in 2003 when he fought against the invasion of Iraq. He then formed the Respect Party, and then, of course, the Workers' Party of Britain back in 2019. He's represented 4 different parts of the country, 4 different towns and cities. Only Winston Churchill has done that. He loves politics, but he's highly divisive, and arguably that's not what we need in our politics right now, but we're going to get it. George Galloway will take his seat next week as an MP for Rochdale.
Yes, and I'm not sure I can count how many times George Galloway himself has been accused of anti-Semitism, lost a job over it from what I can remember, and he stormed to victory, and the Labour Party is saying it's because, the only reason is because they had to disown their own candidate over, guess what, anti-Semitism.
Yeah, the Labour's deeply embarrassed. They've apologised already for saying that their supporters couldn't really vote for anybody. Their candidate Azar Ali, of course, was found to have made dreadful remarks about the Jewish people in Israel after the October 7th attacks. But that only emerged after they printed all the ballot papers, and he couldn't enter a new candidate. So the party was left with disowning its own candidate, removing support, removing any kind of support for them. That's why the Labour vote fell by 47% or so, down from the 10,000 majority which the Sir Tony Lloyd had before he died in January. Deeply embarrassing for Sir Keir Starmer. Labour's focus now is on winning back this seat in the November general election, but it's a long way to go. Whether in the meantime George Galloway might cement his support here, he'll be finding it very hard to hold on to that seat. But deeply embarrassing for the Labour Party, and not really that great for the Tory Party either. A real blow, I think, for the two main parties here in Rochdale.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much for your time, Christopher Hope, who is live in Rochdale, where that by-election took place. Well, now we can speak with Conservative Member of Parliament for South Derbyshire, Heather Wheeler. Heather, thank you very much for joining me on this show. Just your reaction to the by-election result last night.
Well, it was interesting that Christopher said the Conservatives didn't do very well. It wasn't a seat we were going to win, but we were going to put our heart and soul into it, running a really positive campaign. Paul came third, beating two ex-Labour people and Reform, of course. So it proves the point that we are the people that people have to beat. We are going to get our trucks and our tanks on everybody else's lawn and just watch it coming.
Although your candidate was criticised for going on holiday during the run-up to the election, but he said family must come first. That was his excuse anyway. Heather, what does the election of George Galloway, a hugely divisive man, many a time accused of anti-Semitism, what does that say about the state of our politics at this moment?
Really disappointing. And I just find the politics of division not going to help anybody. I think if I had Jewish family now, I would be really quite scared. And I think the way society is polarising is absolutely not good. We really need, when we've got a war going on in Ukraine, not that far away from us in Europe, then we really should, as a country, come together. And these divisive, albeit charismatic people, are really not where, in my opinion, where politics should be.
I agree. I think most people would agree with you that George Galloway is a particularly divisive character. But of course, that accusation has been levelled at your side too. Suella Braverman, also Lee Anderson. Of course, lots of people have said the same about the Conservatives whipping up division too.
Lee Anderson obviously doesn't have the whip anymore. Suella does. I don't know where she was making those particular comments about 3 or 4 days ago. Wasn't sure whether she was abroad or not, like Liz Truss. But the Conservative Party have always been a broad church. I love that. South Derbyshire is an amazing place. I call it one of the original Red Wall seats because we are brilliant here about making things, and we actually work together as a great community. So I don't think people out there really like this divisive stuff, and I think people like people who can be the community champions for them.
But you can't escape the fact that people have said the Conservative Party has a problem with Islamophobia. What can the party do to show that they don't?
Well, we've, in the past, elected, and now, today, indeed, elected Muslim MPs. So I think that that's a little bit far from the mark. I think people need to be realistic about what really is going on in some of our communities and actually work really hard to get community cohesion and not have separate enclaves in one constituency. I think that's a really sad state of affairs.
Yes, and as we've seen with the election result last night, there are politicians who are very much willing to take advantage of divisions and stir up divisions even further. I mean, Heather, what are your hopes for the next election for the Conservatives? The polls are looking pretty dreadful at the moment. Is there any way you can turn it around? We're just hearing today how expensive this Rwanda scheme is, for example, hundreds of millions of pounds with no results so far.
Yeah, we're not allowed to blame judges, are we? Because that's not what we do in this country. The legal process has to go through. We will win the legal process ultimately, and then we will get the planes running off the runways, and people will start going to Rwanda. And as soon as that happens, even with that threat now, the numbers coming in illegally on the boats are down 36%. And that's exactly what the public want to hear. They want to know that we are controlling our borders, and they want to know that we've got a plan to make that happen, which is exactly what we've got. I think Keir Starmer is in trouble, and he knows he's got a real problem with his backbenchers, which is exactly why, sadly, the Speaker did what the Speaker did. And I think that the Speaker was bullied, personally, and I just don't want to see that again in Parliament.
It's difficult to argue you're tough on borders when that legal migration figure keeps increasing so rapidly. But thank you very much indeed for your time, Heather Wheeler. Really great to speak to you, Member of Parliament for South Derbyshire. Thank you. Well, we'll be getting to more of your views on the Rochdale by-election. Brendan says this is a great victory. He will make many MPs look stupid. So there you go. There's a view. Anyway, the cost of Rishi Sunak's troubled Rwanda asylum scheme could soar to £500 million in light of this shocking figure. Is it time to just ditch the plan entirely? I'll be hosting a debate very shortly.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Look, you're a respected royal biographer, and there are so many people who are on the sort of royal gravy train, if you will, people who are making a career out of gossip and speculation. But yours very much built on confidence and sources and fact. And you don't offer an opinion that often inside your book. But when you do, I suppose, therefore, it carries a bit more weight. So when you say that the Sussexes are easily offended and, you know, effectively pretty prickly, what do you mean and what have you based that on?
Well, on numerous their riposte to any given situation in their books, in their TV interviews. And let's not forget, there have been a lot of TV interviews, 6-part Netflix drama, Spare. You see time and again that they feel that they feel resentful. They feel that, you know, something hasn't gone their way and that this is part of some sort of calculated campaign against them. And actually, I mean, when you've got a fast-moving story, I mean, for example, in my book, I go into those frantic hours after the death of the Queen, and everybody's trying to sort themselves out. And Harry writes in his book Spare how you know, no one will return his calls and he can't get through to anyone, and it's sort of it's just all a bit me. And actually, the whole kind of royal machine, if you like, is a team effort. And I just think it's very sad because, you know, Harry and Meghan, they had such potential. And now when we do tend to hear from them, it's on a royal matter, it's just to say how miserable they were being royal. And that was, you know, they were royal for whatever it was, 600-700 days. They're post-royal now for over twice that time.
Can you envisage a scenario where they're back in England and they're back in royal life?
I can't envisage a situation where they're back, as it were, as part of the sort of royal working unit, but I could certainly see it becoming a kind of normal thing for them to keep.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, it's 1:22. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Returning to our top story, as Labour have apologised to the voters of Rochdale for not fielding a candidate, as George Galloway swept to victory in last night's by-election with a whopping 40% of the vote, following what was a chaotic and controversial campaign. Well, I can now speak to David Tully, who finished second place in the Rochdale by-election. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, David. How do you feel after last night, coming second place to George Galloway?
Yeah, obviously I'm quite overwhelmed that I came second. It were a surprise to myself and obviously the people around me, but we did feel there were an undercurrent of me getting votes and moving up the table. So yeah, we were happy and content that obviously people of Rochdale and the community got behind us.
Now, David, am I right in thinking you're a local man who was campaigning on local issues?
Yeah, that's right. That was my main focus, and my passion was to focus on Rochdale and the issues that were in the town. And obviously I engaged in that, and obviously that's what I campaigned about for the last 4 weeks with obviously the people who supported me. So we feel we have had a voice. It's only a small voice, but it's a little stepping stone.
And how did you feel seeing George Galloway's highly divisive campaign? When he won, he said, "This is for Gaza."
Well, to be honest, I didn't really engage with that. I just concentrated on what David Tully were doing and focused on the community of Rochdale, and that's what my campaign and the people supporting me were about. And I feel we did that in a good manner, with community spirit, and that's what I wanted to achieve. And I feel, like I said, we had a small voice in the campaign, and it were all positive from our side and our campaign. So yeah, we didn't really focus on George. We let George focus on himself.
Now, David, some people have spoken about how there was an atmosphere of intimidation at times. Some of the candidates were receiving threats or not allowed into hustings and things like that. Did you feel any sense of that on the ground when you were out campaigning?
Not really, no. My feeling when I went round to all 62 polling stations yesterday, obviously I've lived here and grown up here, so I feel I've got a really good relationship with the whole town and the whole community. So I didn't really engage with any hostile environment. There were obviously a hostings which I didn't officially get invited to, but there were also the BBC had a hostings which I didn't get invited to. So it don't only happen locally, that for an independent, it happened on the national stage as well. So, but obviously that's all an experience and a learning curve for me.
And David, why do you think so many people didn't bother voting in Rochdale?
Probably because, like myself, over the years we feel that we haven't had a voice, and we don't get listened to, and things never change, and the mainstream parties do what they do and don't listen to the people and don't listen to our voice. So I just wanted to step up and be a voice and try and drive that for our town.
And will you do it again, just quickly, lastly?
Well, that seems to be the big question today. So I'm going to obviously have a rest over the weekend, and we'll review what we've done in the last 4 weeks, and potentially that might happen. So, but we'll keep that close to my heart at the minute.
OK, well, thank you very much for joining me on the show, David Tully, who finished second place in the Rochdale by-election. Great to get your perspective on things. Now, the cost of Rishi Sunak's troubled Rwanda asylum scheme could soar to £500 million. The Home Office has so far refused to say how much more it will cost, on top of the £300 million already confirmed. A National Audit Office report has revealed, though, that a whopping £150 million has been earmarked for the partnership over the next 3 years. So it's a very, very expensive scheme. Is it time to give up on the Rwanda plan? Joining me now is former Labour aide and political commentator Stella Stantakidou, who thinks the Rwanda plan should have been given up in its conception, and UKIP leader Neil Hamilton, who still thinks the plan should go ahead. Go on then, Neil. Tell us why it should still go ahead. Hundreds of millions of pounds and no flights taken off.
Well, that's true that the policy so far has been a fiasco. And of course, it can't really work in the longer term, so long as the government remains part of the European Convention on Human Rights and subject to decisions of the court in Strasbourg, because this bill doesn't actually bypass that court. And the Rwandan government have said that if the UK government breaks international law and doesn't follow the rulings of the ECHR, then they won't participate in the scheme. So, but that's another point. I think that I'm in favour of the scheme of outsourcing asylum claims and sending people to safe countries like Rwanda. I hope there'll be others that we can do this. It is an expensive scheme because so far it's been very badly managed. What's the cost of doing nothing? We're spending £6 billion a year at the moment on asylum seekers and their claims in the United Kingdom. And this is going to continue. As we know, every time there's a lull in the weather in the Channel, hundreds more come across in small boats. So something has got to be done. We need a government with more spine than we to make this policy work properly.
Well, thanks, Neil, for your opening gambit. But Stella, that's a good point that Neil made there, isn't it? The cost of not doing the Rwanda scheme is very high as well.
Emily, there is zero evidence that what Neil is saying is going to work. There is zero evidence that the Rwanda plan is going to work. Very often, you see that happening in policy. Politicians will see a policy that looks really good on a Daily Mail front page, and they will go for it. But actually, they will not have done any analysis that shows that what they've done is going to work. They've sent 0 asylum seekers to Rwanda so far. They've only sent home secretaries. I think after hearing the numbers that were revealed on Friday, even the staunchest, most anti-immigration voter will be thinking, surely we can spend this money somewhere else. Surely there is another concern that we can address. So the British voter, there is 3 top concerns, right? So you have the economy, the NHS, and immigration. So for sure, immigration is a very important topic for voters. However, in the last 4 days, the government has committed 8 million for children's mental health. Now tell me, is it worth it? Are our kids, our children's mental health worth 8 million and sending less than 1% of asylum cases to Rwanda worth 580 million? Now, Rishi Sunak has said over the weekend that Islamists are in control of the UK. So is it the Islamists who should be really...
Well, he didn't quite say that, did he, Stella? He said that we're at risk of having mob rule instead of democratic rule. He did say that. It was Suella Braverman who said that Islamists are taking over.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. Suella Braverman said that Islamists are taking over. Rishi Sunak just said we're just in danger. So much better. We're in danger of someone else.
I take your point. I take your point, though, over the prioritising of public spending. And at the moment, this does look like rather a large waste of money so far if no flights take off and if it doesn't act as a deterrent. But, Neil, you say this is about legislation. This is about the European Court of Human Rights, more importantly, that's preventing the Rwanda scheme.
Well, obviously, the scheme can't start until the legislation goes through Parliament. So it's a ridiculous point to say that this cost all this money and we haven't sent a single migrant to Rwanda. But once it goes through Parliament, assuming that it does, then the government will be able to put people on planes. But what will happen then, I tell you quite confidently now, is that there will be direct appeals to the court in Strasbourg, and the court in Strasbourg will impose an interim injunction to stop these deportations. And then the government will have to decide, are they going to ignore the court or are they going to kowtow out its rulings? And if they do ignore the court, the Rwandan government is not going to participate in this scheme. So they're in a cleft stick whilst they remain inside the European Convention on Human Rights. The scheme could be made to work if we leave the convention. That's what we need to do.
Well, Stella, you do concede that this is a massive issue for the electorate. It may not be your number one, but you say it's regularly in the top 3. People want something to be done about this. If it means leaving the ECHR or ignoring rulings, what's the problem with that?
But I don't actually think that this is going to solve the problem. That's my issue. We are talking about less than 1% of asylum cases. This is not going to change by us becoming the laughingstock of the world, by the UK actively showing that they don't care about international law. We don't need to be the laughingstock of Europe to solve our immigration crisis. I think what people are struggling to believe is that the public management, the government management of immigration in the UK has been so bad, and that the reason why we are struggling with solving our immigration problems is because we have bad public management by our politicians and lies by our political class.
Neil?
Well, talking of lies, of course, the Labour Party has no plan whatsoever to control migration. The idea that the Labour Party is going to be tougher than Tories, weak as they are, is just absurd and for the birds. I mean, Labour is now overwhelmingly dependent on the votes of migrants, of course, in all our big cities. And Rochdale, I suppose, is a very dramatic expression of what is happening to our country through uncontrolled mass migration. We've had 6 million people added to our population in the last 10 years. And this can only get worse because the numbers are going up exponentially. We added 650,000 to our population last year alone, and things are getting worse. Labour has no answer to this at all, no policy to call effective at all.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Neil Hamilton there, and Stella too. Thank you very much for joining me. Great debate. Now, coming up, we're going to be back in Rochdale for your reaction to George Galloway's win last night. We'll also be hearing from Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove. What's he got to say? That's after your headlines with Sam.
Emily, thanks very much. It's just gone 1:30, and we start with some breaking news coming to us out of the Old Bailey this afternoon. That a man has been jailed for life in what the judge there described as a horrific catalogue of murders. Joshua Jacques killed his girlfriend Samantha Drummonds and 3 members of her family in Bermondsey in south-east London. The court heard the 29-year-old stabbed his victims in what he claimed was a sacrifice. He admitted manslaughter but denied murder on the basis that he was mentally unwell at the time. He's been ordered to serve a minimum term of 46 years. As we've been hearing today, Rishi Sunak has now said the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who brings division and, they say, hate to every place he has ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented TV programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. The cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million, plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant that's sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. And we understand there will also be an extra £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs. A man has been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge has described as a ferocious and merciless attack on his former partner and her new boyfriend. 27-year-old Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett, who was 25, were killed by Marcus Osborne. The court heard today that he waited for Miss Higton at the house he used to share with her before using her phone to lure her new partner to that address. And the cost of a postage stamp is going up as Royal Mail raises prices yet again amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class stamps are also going up by that same amount, 10 pence to 85 pence a stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. Those are the headlines. For more, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
And here's a look at the markets this afternoon. The pound will buy you $1.2634 and €1.1684. The price of gold is currently £1,624.90. That's per ounce. And the FTSE 100's at 7,681 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
I'm Andrew Doyle.
Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Ken, do you find the Union flag, the Union Jack, divisive?
In some situation, but as Simon quite clearly stated, and I agree with everything that he says in regards that there's situation when people use it for ulterior motive to cause fear, alarm and distress. We saw that with the far right when they came up to saying protecting the Churchill statues and things of that nature. But largely on the large whole, even I wave the St. George's flag on a sporting occasion. And I don't see anything wrong in raising the Union Jack or the St. George's flag so long as the intention is correct. And as he says, Mr. Brockhurst, he served for the country and he should have every right to be proud of what he's done and the way that he wants to display it.
All right, Simon, what do you make of this kind of, I would argue it as like student social media-based politics, where you get these pillocks from the Green Party or whatever saying, oh, it's divisive and I can't believe it. It will be legal in this country to do... Do those people need to get out more? I was on the streets of Stratford earlier on, an incredibly diverse place, speaking to a massive range of people right across different age demographics. I couldn't find a single sausage who said to me that they thought that this guy from the Green Party was right.
He obviously has absolutely no attention from anybody, and this is his way of finding attention. Both Ken and myself, we both agree that nobody should use any symbol of national identity to offend others deliberately, because that's just inflaming a situation. There's so much sensitivity around so many things today, and people do get offended by so much so quickly without any rhyme or reason.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 1:40 and returning to our top story as Labour have apologised to the voters of Rochdale for not fielding a candidate as George Galloway swept to victory in last night's by-election. Almost 40% of the vote he won following what was a chaotic and controversial campaign. Now Sir Keir Starmer has said Galloway only won because Labour did not stand after their candidate Azhar Ali was dropped for suggesting Israel was complicit in Hamas's October attack. Well, we can now hear from Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer.
George Galloway only won this election because the Labour campaign imploded. Do you accept it's your fault Galloway is back into Parliament? And will you review your candidate vetting processes going forward?
Galloway only won because Labour didn't stand a candidate. I regret that we had to withdraw our candidate and apologise to voters in Rochdale. But I took that decision. It was the right decision. And when I say I've changed the Labour Party, I mean it. Obviously, we will put a first-class candidate, a unifier, before the voters in Rochdale at the general election.
And have you ever taken a tougher position on Israel that you've now abandoned? And if you did say that, why have you shifted your position now?
I think the right thing is to concentrate on the awful situation in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Hostages are still being held for a very long time. And therefore, the right thing is for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to ensure that hostages can get out, humanitarian aid desperately needed can get in, and that we can put our foot in the door for a process, a political process, to a two-state solution that involves the recognition of Palestine. That's what I'm focusing my attention on. That is the only way through this awful situation.
Are you confident Azhar Ali will be the last Labour candidate to be suspended for anti-Semitism?
I put in place a very tough due process for the Labour Party. And most of the criticism in the last 2 years has been that process is too tough. I'll continue that in place because I will only put first-class candidates before the electorate at the general election.
Well, there we go. Keir Starmer putting a positive spin on the result last night. But we can now speak with the political correspondent at The Spectator, James Heal. James, I assume you were up all night last night to see the election result there. Was the result a shock?
I certainly think it was the margin of the victory that was the real shock here, Emily, which was, almost 6,000 a majority for George Galloway here. And listening to that clip right there, Keir Starmer can talk about the right decision was made. Well, that right decision to suspend Labour's candidate there took almost 48 hours. And I have to say, I think that the farcical nature in which the Labour leadership conducted itself over that only exacerbated the margin of the majority by which George Galloway was triumphant.
And what do you say, looking at the way this campaign was run, looking at the way George Galloway in particular commanded votes, very much the focus on what's happening in the Middle East rather than local issues, although he did have different literature, different campaign material, depending on who he was trying to get a vote from, depending on demographics, perhaps. James, what's your overall view of that, how it was conducted?
All parties do that to a certain extent, but it's the cynicism of George Galloway's campaign that is so richly, grimly amusing, which was that, and he was saying one thing to groups of voters in Rochdale from one parts of the community and quite another to other parts. And I think what was so striking was that, he would talk in some bits of his literature about wanting a new Primark, etc. in the constituency, and other bits he would, when he said his victory speech, he said this is a victory for Gaza. So I think it's what the more interesting lesson here from George Galloway's campaign is how actually there is a voice in the country that needs to be given amplification, which is people calling for a different type of foreign policy, but also Galloway is a social and cultural conservative. And I think that is a vacuum which someone is waiting to fill in British politics. And the fact that the two main parties, and the Liberal Democrats as well, didn't finish in the top two here, that should be a warning sign to parties across the country in Westminster.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned that his social conservatism on issues like abortion, even. He has a strong view on that, or he has done in the past. George Galloway, lots of people may know him best from Big Brother. What sort of man do you think he'll be in the House of Commons this time around? It may be short-lived, of course.
Of course, yeah. We're expecting an election later this year, and at that you'd expect Labour to take back the seat, just like they did last time Galloway was in the House of Commons in 2015 after a by-election triumph. I think George Galloway will be in Parliament like he was on Celebrity Big Brother, a complete opportunist, only in it for the main chance. But that's what he's going to be, and I'm sure he's going to make life hell for Keir Starmer every opportunity. There's already talk he might intervene in next week's budget debate. I'm sure we can expect lots of bobbing up and down at Prime Minister's questions. And of course, we've never really seen George Galloway in the social media age, and so I therefore think he'll be trying to get lots of clips for TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, which can go viral. So there's a lot of hate and anger out there, and George Galloway would seem the perfect man to try and exploit that.
Yes, it may well be a bizarre performance, to say the least, much like his performance in Big Brother. Thank you very much, James Heal, political correspondent at The Spectator. Great to speak to you. Well, we can now hear from Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove, who has been interviewed by GB News political correspondent Catherine Forster about a range of issues, including, of course, his reaction to George Galloway's by-election victory.
Michael Gove, we're here to talk about levelling up at the North, but can I first just get your quick reaction to the fact that George Galloway is coming back to Parliament and what that might do for community tensions?
The first thing is we're all Democrats, so I've got to congratulate George Galloway on his victory. But I am fundamentally opposed to the platform on which George Galloway stood. I think that George is sowing the politics of division. I think that the approach that he's been taking, rather than bringing communities together at a challenging time, will only polarise people further. I think his approach towards the war in the Middle East is one which won't contribute to peace, and it shows no sympathy or understanding for the position of Israel. But also, here in the UK, we had a by-election campaign which, instead of being about housing, about health and about education, was one which was about division. and one which will only drive extremists further apart. So in that sense, I regret George Galloway's victory, and I think it only emphasises the need for all of us to stand together against extremism and to celebrate what brings people together in this great country.
And we're here in Leeds, and in 2019, the Red Wall, Boris Johnson won millions of votes promising to level up the country. Plenty of voters up here feel that that hasn't happened and that they've been let down. Have you?
I don't believe so. I know that GBNews as a channel is particularly popular in the north of England, and you've got a great viewership there, many of whom are concerned that the Conservative government may not have their interests at heart. Let me assure you, our announcements today are real investment, making a difference in communities in the north. Improved transport for people in Leeds, Bradford and West Yorkshire. Improvement to make sure that cultural jewels in Blackburn are restored to greatness. Improvement in Blackpool to the housing that people have. But there are other priorities that people in the north of England have. They want to make sure, yes, that public spending is there, but they also want to make sure that, for example, we're taking the tough action on migration that is required. And it's only the Conservative Party that is taking that tough action. We've seen, for example, the number of small boat crossings reduced by 1/3 in the last year. So I would hope that people, wherever they are in the UK, but particularly in the north of England, would recognise that this is a government that believes in their values and is executing the policies they'd like to see.
But let's just take transport. George Osborne promised Northern Powerhouse Rail, fast rail between Liverpool and Leeds and Bradford. You promised HS2 to Leeds. That was cut in 2021. Then Rishi Sunak went and stood in a disused railway station in Manchester and cut the leg to Manchester as well. Can you understand why people in the north are loath to believe these promises? They've heard it all before and it hasn't been delivered.
I think the most important transport investments are investments in the north that make it easier for people to move between and within the towns and cities that they live in and they love. So the announcement that I've made today on additional investment for transport in West Yorkshire is about a mass transit system in Leeds and Bradford. And that will link Leeds and Bradford more effectively to Wakefield, to Huddersfield and to Halifax. And those are the transport links that really matter, because at the moment, the travel to time work for people who live in the communities just outside Leeds is significantly greater than in comparable cities. So that's the sort of difference on the ground that I think really benefits people who face tough commutes and who also need, for example, to be able to get their kids to sports fixtures and make sure that the daily hassle of prolonged travelling times can be reduced.
With the benefit of hindsight, wouldn't it have been better to start with connectivity east-west and between cities in the north rather than just getting to and from London a bit quicker?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And I think one of the key things is that we are investing in Northern Powerhouse Rail, and we are making sure that journey times from Hull to Sheffield and on to Liverpool are reduced. And I think, in an ideal world, with infinite resources, we would improve transport links everywhere. But when you've got to prioritise, I believe it is right to prioritise links across the north, you're right, east-west, but also within cities so that people who do live in Halifax, Huddersfield, Wakefield can get into Leeds and Bradford more quickly.
The budget's coming on Wednesday. There's not a lot of money around. Is it really the time for tax cuts?
Yeah, well, obviously the Chancellor will decide, but I think lower taxes is the route to economic growth. So, of course, people spend their own money more wisely than anyone else can on their behalf. And it is only right that hard-working people are able to keep more of what they earn. But it's also the case that if you keep taxes at the right level and cut them at the right time, then you get additional investment into this country. I've announced today significant investment in improving public services, in giving money to local communities. And I think the right approach is a balanced approach, and that's the one that we've taken. And on the economy, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have got inflation down. Under Labour, we'd have higher taxes, more borrowing, and we go back to square one.
And finally, you're in a pretty big electoral hole at the moment. Now, Boris Johnson got you out of a similar hole back in 2019. Do you really believe that you can still win the next election? And would you like to see Boris Johnson come back and campaign with you to put the Conservatives back in office?
Well, the first thing is, yes, I absolutely believe. I've been involved in campaigns in the past where we started out in the low 20s and we ended up getting 52% of the vote. I was one of the people involved in the Brexit campaign. Campaigns can change people's minds, and you can win even when it appears at the start of the campaign you're pretty far behind. And talking of that Brexit campaign, of course, Boris played a big part in that. Boris is a great campaigner. What I would like to see is the whole Conservative family come together in order to ensure that this country doesn't face the nightmare of a Keir Starmer premiership. Starmer is, as the Prime Minister pointed out this week, spineless, shameless. He cannot be relied on to stand up for this country, either against extremist intimidation or in an increasingly competitive world. So that's why it's so important we have a Conservative government.
Michael Gove, thank you very much for talking to us today on GB News.
Thank you.
Well, there we go. There was Catherine Forster, our political correspondent, with Michael Gove. You convinced? If you're living in the north, do you believe that the Conservatives are doing the right thing when it comes to transport, infrastructure in the north, or have they completely neglected the issue? Safe to say they've certainly wasted a lot of our money on various infrastructure projects that have not got, or at least not arrived where they should arrive, and at the right date as well. Please keep your views coming in as well on the Rochdale by-election. Alan says it will be very interesting to see what reception Galloway gets when he goes into the Commons for the first time. Yes, I can't imagine it will be a thunderous applause. Can you? I imagine there may be silence or indeed some heckling or perhaps the odd boo coming towards George Galloway. I'm sure that will be the case, but I'm not sure he minds, really. He courts controversy, doesn't he, that man? And Gary says, getting worried with this result and the potential abuse of postal votes. Could the general election be the last chance for the ballot box? Yes, this question of postal votes, I'm going to come back to this later on in the show as well, because I do think it's worth talking about. If there's a sudden increase in the number of postal votes in an election, one has to ask the question, why? And can they be corrupted in one way or another? But anyway, moving on. British Jews say Galloway's victory in Rochdale is a dark day for the Jewish community. Are they right? I'll be joined in the next hour by an expert on anti-Semitism to get his view. That's after this very short break. Stay with us. This is GB News. Good afternoon, Britain.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. The rest of the day will remain cold wherever you are. There's a further risk of rain, showers and some hill snow. Got low pressure still in charge. That's got cold air wrapped around it as well as these occluded fronts. And that's where the focus for the most persistent rain will continue to be. That area will push into more southern areas of Scotland through this evening and then into northern Scotland later on tonight. So we could see snow falling above around 150 to 200 metres. Further south, it should stay drier for a time this evening, but overnight this more persistent area of rain will push in to the south coast and then up towards the Midlands. That brings a risk of snow to some lower levels by tomorrow morning. So it will be a cold start to the weekend wherever you are, and it will remain quite overcast and wet through much of the day for central areas of England as well as northern areas of England later on by mid-morning. Further south and west, we'll see a mix of sunshine and showers, but those showers bring a risk of heavy downpours as well as some hail and further hill snow. So another quite unsettled and cold feeling day to come through tomorrow. Sunday is looking much drier on the whole. There's still a risk of showers, particularly across the south as well as the far north, but many areas should see a much drier day with a greater chance of some sunshine. And it won't feel too bad in the sunshine. We are now into meteorological spring, but there is some further rain to move into the southwest later on Monday. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's
So
sake,
basic-
civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes. Something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this
Yes?
training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
Yeah.
But I'm all right with people, because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
But do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law, because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying, rather than huffing and puffing and rolling your eyes, if you've got a disagreement with someone, say I've got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each other.
Why do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Friday, the 1st of March. Sir Keir Starmer has woken up this morning to his worst nightmare. Those are the words of a triumphant George Galloway as he stormed to victory in what's been described as a dark day for the Jewish community. How worried should Keir Starmer be, and what does the election say about the state of British politics? It's revealed the British taxpayer is set to pay at least £370 million to Rwanda and a further potential payment of £20,000 per person relocated. Is it time to call quits on this expensive and so far failing scheme? And 1 billion people worldwide are now obese, including 159 million children. Scientists claim the danger is now a greater threat than hunger. The World Health Organization says the food industry must be held accountable. But are bans and taxes the way to go? And please do keep those views coming in about the Rochdale by-election. That result, George Galloway storming to victory with 40% of the vote. Let me know what you think. But also, Michael Gove there speaking to Catherine Forster. He seems to think that the Conservatives still stand a chance, that they've had, you know, polling ratings in the 20s and they can bring it up and storm to victory. It's all to play for. Do you agree, or do you think it's over for the Conservatives this time around? They did come third in this by-election, which is better than some were thinking anyway, but it was rather a bizarre election, not really going to be extrapolated across the country, I doubt. But let me know what you think. Do you trust Michael Gove there, especially when he talks about levelling up and the fiasco over HS2? Keep your views coming in. gbviews@gbnews.com. But first, your headlines with Sam.
Emily, thank you very much. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. Leading the news at just after 2 o'clock, Rishi Sunak has said the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times. That's after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has also described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who they say brings division and hate to every place that he has ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented television programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. While taking to the stage last night, Mr Galloway said his victory was for Gaza.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price for the role that you have played in enabling, encouraging and covering for the catastrophe presently going on in occupied Palestine in the Gaza Strip.
Last night's vote saw a sharp rise in postal votes, though we understand there's been no evidence so far of any irregularities. GB News spoke to local residents in Rochdale earlier following that result overnight, and here's what they had to say.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time.
He played into the hands of the population, really, just to get into that position of power, really, to get that seat in Rochdale. I think he's done it selfishly just to get into government.
I'm just really disappointed. I mean, the man, he doesn't live here. This is the third political party he's managed to wangle himself into.
Well, we've learned today that the cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million, plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant that's sent to the African nation. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. And there'll also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated there, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs over a 5-year period. The Prime Minister, though, says the plan is vital to clamping down on illegal migration.
Taxpayers are already forking out millions of pounds a day to house illegal migrants in hotels across the country. That's not right, and that's why I made stopping the boats one of my priorities. I'm pleased that we've made progress. Last year the numbers were down by a third. That never happened before, shows that the plans are working. But in order to fully resolve this issue, we need to have a deterrent. We need to be able to say, if you come here illegally, you won't be able to stay. We can remove you to a safe country. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important. It's the worthwhile investment, and I'm determined to see it through.
A man has been jailed for life for what the judge described at the Old Bailey today as a horrific catalogue of murders. Joshua Jacques killed his girlfriend Samantha Drummonds and 3 members of her family in Bermondsey in south-east London in 2022. The court heard the 29-year-old stabbed his victims in what he claimed was a sacrifice. He admitted manslaughter but denied murder on the grounds that he was mentally unwell at the time. He's been ordered to serve a minimum term of 46 years. And we've also heard today that another man has been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge described as a ferocious and merciless attack on his former partner and her new boyfriend. 27-year-old Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett, who was 25, were killed by Marcus Osborne. The court heard today that he waited for Miss Higton at the house they used to share before he used her phone to lure her new partner to that address. He then continued his violent attack, raping another woman and holding her captive at that home. Well, to Moscow, where hundreds have gathered this morning in a bid saying goodbye to the late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Crowds this morning were heard chanting his name as the coffin was carried into the church in the Russian capital. The Kremlin warned that any unsanctioned gatherings in support of Navalny would violate the law. Mr. Navalny's allies have accused the Russian president of killing his political rival, a claim that's been echoed by Britain, the US and many others. The cost of a postage stamp is going up again as the Royal Mail raises prices amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class stamps are also going up by the same amount to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. The increase comes after warnings by the troubled delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which they say is pushing up its costs. And if you missed it this morning, here's a reminder of the UK's Eurovision entry.
Won't you make me dizzy from your kisses? Will you take my hand and spin me round and round until...
Ollie Alexander has launched that brand new single called Dizzy ahead of this year's song contest due to take place in Sweden in May. The 33-year-old singer has already enjoyed success with his former bandmates in Years and Years, scoring a combined 5 top 10 UK singles and 2 #1 albums. And he hopes that the new single will, he says, transport you somewhere magical. Those are the latest headlines. For more, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, though, it's back to Emily.
Right, well, the Labour Party has apologised to the people of Rochdale for not fielding a candidate as George Galloway swept to victory in last night's by-election with almost 40% of the vote in a campaign which was mired in chaos and controversy. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has said Galloway only won because Labour did not stand after their candidate Azhar Ali was dropped for suggesting Israel was complicit in the Hamas October attack. Well, the former Labour and Respect MP, who now leads the Workers' Party of Britain, took fire at the Labour leader in his victory speech.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza. You have paid and you will pay a high price.
Well, there's what the victorious George Galloway had to say, but how are the residents of Rochdale feeling about what was a chaotic by-election result and campaign? Let's speak with GB News reporter Jack Carson, who's been with the voters themselves. Jack, what are people saying? How are people feeling now that George Galloway has been elected?
Well, certainly a mixed reaction. Those of Galloway's supporters who have spoken to absolutely delighted, of course, as at this result. Quite a surprise, maybe not so much after the issues, of course, with Labour's initial candidate Azhar Ali. After that anti-Semitism row, that a lot of voters didn't feel like they could trust the Labour Party to support them, whichever way, because there's a lot of Galloway supporters that I've spoken to this morning that were delighted that he won, that still didn't feel like they could trust Labour from their side of the argument, particularly over, of course, Sir Keir Starmer's stance and the Labour Party stance over what's going on in Gaza, and of course with the idea of a ceasefire. Galloway receiving, of course, just under 12,500 votes, a much lower turnout, certainly less than what, of course, we see at the likes of general elections, where here in Rochdale in 2019 it was around 65%, only just under 40% turning out yesterday. But of course, still a significant win for Galloway, but also lots of people still unhappy. That, of course, big campaign message, as we heard in his victory speech in that clip there from Galloway, that he's saying that win was for Gaza. Lots of residents here not feeling like he's necessarily the kind of member of Parliament that will really take their issues down to Westminster and put those local issues to Parliament. But here's what a few people on the street told me a little bit earlier on.
I think it's an absolute disgrace. What's he going to do for Rochdale? I just don't know.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time.
So ashamed of being in Rochdale. Yeah, I'm just really disappointed.
And you've got Galloway, who's basically turned around and said that he'll only do stuff for Palestine, nothing about the people that live in Rochdale.
I can't think of anything that he's done for anybody else. So what the hell is he going to do for Rochdale?
I think he took advantage of the situation in Gaza and the very large Asian population.
of course, Labour still very much were expected to win this seat. Of course, they didn't in the end field the candidate. Their party saying that that is one of the reasons why, of course, Mr Galloway got that victory here last night, but also not trying to deal on those hypotheticals. Ellie Reeves, of course, is the co-campaign coordinator for Labour, saying that their position was very clear. Of course, we saw all the trouble in Westminster, didn't we, last week with that Labour amendment calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. There's other caveats to that as well as not wanting, of course, the likes of Netanyahu to go into Rafah. So Labour pretty sure that they're not going to change their position on that ceasefire, and that, of course, they are now aiming towards that general election later in the year, where they hope they can pick up the likes of Rochdale again. But of course, we've heard Galloway's plans himself to try and put up around 60 prospective candidates. So this argument's certainly not over just yet.
Thanks, Jack. Well, the people of Rochdale that you spoke to certainly knew what the whole campaign was about when it came to George Galloway. Thank you for your time, Jack Carson, who is in Rochdale for us. Now, we have got some breaking news in for you. Thomas Kingston, the husband of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's daughter, Lady Gabriella Kingston, died from traumatic head wound, and a gun was found near to his body in an outbuilding at his parents' home in the Cotswolds. An inquest opening at Gloucester Coroner's Court heard. Right, let's get the details from Cameron Walker, our royal correspondent. Cameron, tell me, what's happened? What have we found out?
Yeah, so this is clearly some very distressing details that is coming out in the Coroner's Court in Gloucestershire this afternoon. We must stress, of course, this is only the opening of the inquest and not the coroner's conclusions. But as you just said, Emily, Thomas Kingston, who is the husband of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's daughter Lady Gabriella Kingston, formerly Windsor, died from a traumatic head wound, and a gun was found near to his body in an outbuilding at his parents' home in the Cotswolds. That is what the court has heard. So let's just rewind to the circumstances to exactly what happened. Buckingham Palace announced earlier this week that Thomas Kingston had died suddenly on Sunday, as in last Sunday. Gloucestershire Police released a statement shortly afterwards saying that we were called by the ambulance service at 6:25 p.m. on Sunday with a report of the death of a 45-year-old man at an address in the Cotswolds. The death is not being treated as suspicious, and a file is being prepared for the coroner. Well, this, of course, is the opening of the inquest. Clearly, a very distressing time for the royal family, with Mr Kingston's death, as well as His Majesty the King's cancer diagnosis and the Princess of Wales's abdominal surgery. Lady Gabriella paid tribute, as you can see on your screens now, to her husband, who was a financier. A joint statement with his family describing him as an exceptional man who lit up the lives of all who knew him. They described his death as a great shock to the whole family. The King and Queen, as well, sent their most heartfelt thoughts and prayers when Buckingham Palace announced his death. But just to recap, what the opening of that inquest into the death of Thomas Kingston has heard this morning is that he died from a traumatic head wound, and a gun was found near to his body in an outbuilding at his parents' home in the Cotswolds. Of course, the inquest is ongoing, and the coroner will release their conclusions at a later date.
And Cameron, are we expecting to hear from the royal family themselves, from the palace?
No, I suspect not, to be honest. It was a pretty lengthy statement which they gave when they announced Thomas Kingston's death earlier this week. Clearly, this is a private family. Lady Gabriella Kingston is not a working member of the royal family, and therefore there's no real public interest in his death, in the sense that he is not a working member of the royal family. I think Buckingham Palace have already given us a statement, well, not a statement, but the King and Queen's thoughts on the whole matter. Lady Gabriella Windsor has chosen to publicly pay tribute to her late husband, but I think the palace seems to be giving us the suggestion that they want the country to respect the family's privacy at this difficult time.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cameron Walker, our royal correspondent, bringing us that breaking news from the inquest that told Thomas Kingston died from a traumatic head wound. Thank you for your time, Cameron. Now we're going to head back to Rochdale to the results of that by-election last night and what it might mean for the Jewish community. We're going to speak to now Stephen Silverman, who is the Director of Investigations and Enforcement at the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Thank you very much for joining me, Stephen. Now, George Galloway, I think it's fair to say, an extremely divisive character, many accusations of anti-Semitism over the years. He very much mobilised the issue of Gaza, the issue of Israel-Palestine to win this by-election. How might some of the Jewish community be feeling at this result?
Well, let's consider how they were feeling immediately before this result. We know that 90% of them hide away indoors when anti-Israel marches are taking place. They do not feel safe to go outside. Almost 70% of them, when they do go outside, hide any visible signs of their Jewish identity because it isn't safe. So this result will have done nothing whatsoever to calm their nerves. Their nerves will have not been calmed by the sight today of social media awash with images of George Galloway being very chummy with leaders of Hamas, although I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for that. And if you look at what happened on the BBC Today programme this morning, his deputy, Chris Williamson, who was kicked out of Labour for saying Labour had been too soft on anti-Semitism, he was interviewed on the Today programme. He refused to condemn Hamas for the atrocity committed on the 7th of October. And he stated that the Israeli innocent lives lost were killed by the IDF. This is essentially the same slur, the same anti-Semitic slur that got the Labour candidate into trouble in the first place. So, you know, it is a very, very worrying time. Is George Galloway's party going to be a home for crank conspiracy theorists? George Galloway himself does have a history of baiting the Jewish community. I'll give you a few examples. When campaigning in Bradford, he declared it to be an Israel-free zone. In other words, citizens of the only Jewish state in the world won't welcome there. When talking about the institutional anti-Semitism that existed in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, he made comparisons with the propaganda of Goebbels. Now, you would think that someone with even a shred of concern for Jewish sensibilities would choose their language more carefully. And then in 2019, after Tottenham were defeated in the Champions League final, the club accused him of blatant anti-Semitism following remarks he made on Twitter. Despite his denials, he was subsequently fired over the matter by Talk Radio. And this is just these are just excerpts from a long rap sheet.
Yes, you pick up on some key examples there. What do you say to those who would argue that George Galloway represents a large minority, perhaps, of voters in this country, and this is democracy? He mobilised those voters. He went out campaigning on an issue that meant a lot to a lot of people in Rochdale, and that's why he won. And it's, you know, for the other candidates to put forward their case in an equally strong way.
Well, look, I mean, I know that others have expressed concerns about the way the election was conducted, but that's not an area that I can comment on. What I can say is if you are getting elected with rhetoric that is going to be divisive and inflammatory and exacerbate a hatred that we are already seeing overflowing onto our streets, then, you know, is that really the best advertisement for democracy at work? We are seeing that because of this kind of rhetoric, Jews are being intimidated in public. We've just had another disturbing video emerge today of a Jewish man being intimidated on the London Underground, of Jews being violently attacked in public, so seriously that they had to go to hospital. And the concern is that if George Galloway continues to engage in the kind of rhetoric that he is known for, it is certainly not going to pour oil on troubled waters. It is going to agitate them even further.
Stephen, are you worried that we could see similar candidates to George Galloway, mobilising what's happening in the Middle East for electoral gain. We could see more independent candidates, for example, running against Labour in some parts of the country.
Well, you would hope that anybody running for Parliament for any particular constituency would be doing it because they cared about issues such as employment, housing, education, and not about a conflict that's taking place 3,000 miles ago. But it seems to remain the fact that, you know, it is possible to use that as a platform to leverage yourself into the House of Commons, and it is entirely possible that we will see others trying to do that.
And how do you see social cohesion in this country moving forward? That is one of the worries that keeps many people up at night, the worry that our society in some ways is breaking down in ethnic, religious lines, made worse by the way this conflict in particular has been reported on, and also people feel so passionately about it. There is a worry that we're becoming more and more divided. How can we bring communities together?
Well, I mean, this is certainly the worst I've seen it in my lifetime. I would never have imagined that it could get this bad. It is very difficult, and I think we are now in a position where it has to be a combination of the carrot and the stick. Education is going to be really key, starting early in schools, because kids are picking up inaccurate information, propaganda on social media and imbibing it as the truth. We also need to see better law enforcement. There are laws that can act against people who behave in a way that is inciting hatred. They're not being adequately enforced. And we just need to see that happening more and more if we are going to have a proper deterrent against this. And as I say, we need this to be addressed properly within the education system if we are going to remedy it properly.
Yeah, good point. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Stephen Silverman. Really appreciate it. Director of Investigations and Enforcement at the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Now, the cost of Rishi Sunak's troubled Rwanda asylum scheme could soar to £500 million. We'll bring you the details and ask, is it all worth it? After this short break.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens with our team of dedicated journalists across the UK. We're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, you know, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offender behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 2:27. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Let's move this story along, this by-election news along, and ask what this means for a general election, what it could mean for a general election anyway. Joining me now is Jim Pickard, Deputy Political Editor at the Financial Times. Jim, great to speak to you. So, this election result, whether it's shocking or surprise, is up for debate. But what could it mean for a general election?
So I think it was quite a surprising result. I mean, I think it probably was a shocking result because there was a point a few weeks ago where people thought that Reform UK could take the seat. They thought that maybe the former Labour candidate could possibly still take the seat. And so for George Galloway to get 12,000 votes, you know, he got more than several of the major parties combined in that seat. I think it was hugely surprising. But I'm going to say I don't really think there's a major read across to the general election. And the reason for that is because there were specific circumstances in this race. Of course, Labour Party didn't stand in the end. George Galloway is a particularly charismatic A-list celebrity politician. Whether you love him or whether you loathe him, he is a very, very big figure. And there are also only a limited number of seats where the Muslim population is as large as the one in Rochdale, where it's over 30% of the vote. And therefore, you know, there will be pockets at the general election where and it's not only Muslims, by the way, who are angry amongst the British public about what's happening in the Gaza Strip, but you know, using the shorthand of Muslims being unhappy about Labour's position on Israel and Gaza, there are a fair few seats, maybe the East End of London, maybe the North West, maybe a bit of South Yorkshire, where the issue could play into how people decide to vote. But I don't think you're going to see pro-Palestinian protesters of the kind of George Galloway actually getting into Parliament in the general election. And it's not impossible that Galloway himself is ejected by the people of Rochdale in a general election, just because the dynamics of a general election are so completely different to the dynamics of a by-election.
Yes, because, Jim, quite a lot has been made of the potential for independent candidates to rise up against Labour candidates in mostly Labour seats in countries where there is a considerable... in constituencies where there is a considerable Muslim vote who are concerned about what's going on in Gaza. But you think that won't be widespread?
So I was looking at some polling earlier, which I think was from Savanta, the respected polling agency, and they were saying that support for the Labour Party among Muslims is still at somewhere around 65%, I think they said, which was down from maybe somewhere in the 70 or 75 percentage points at the last election. So although there is genuinely an awful lot of anger about Keir Starmer among an awful lot of Muslim voters, not just Muslim voters, that doesn't necessarily mean that in a general election they would desert the party altogether, because they know that the Conservative position on Israel, Palestine, is actually more pro-Israeli than Labour's, and therefore in a first-past-the-post system where there are only two really big parties, you know, like a lot of voters, they are likely to go for the least worst alternative. So I don't think the Labour Party are completely complacent about this. They think there are maybe half a dozen seats where the end result could be changed as a result of this, but it's more kind of losing the Muslim vote in an East London seat could see someone else, for example, the Conservatives, getting in.
I guess there may well be
But
quite a lot of
handful of seats.
apathy at the next general election. The turnout has been pretty low in the last few by-elections, at least. I know a general election is very different and there's a much longer campaign, but even so, there could be quite a lot of people in this country, a large proportion, who simply don't want to put their cross in anyone's box. That does leave it more open for independent candidates running on one-issue campaigns to get through.
I think you're 100% right about the level of apathy out there. There was a survey by the Office for National Statistics that came out today, and it said that only 12% of people in Britain now trust political parties, inverted commas, and that had declined by an astonishing 8 points from a year ago when 20% of the British public still had faith in political parties. And so that's quite shocking, I think, to someone of my generation. I'm getting on a bit that only around 1 in 10 people actually have any sort of belief in the political parties. I was up in Grimsby on Tuesday and Wednesday talking to local people for a piece I'm doing ahead of the general election, and it's impossible to predict which way it's going to go. A lot of people think that Labour is going to take back Grimsby in the way that they're expected to take back a lot of the so-called Red Wall. But the one thing that came across to me talking to loads of people there was how unhappy they are about Westminster politics, how unhappy they are about conventional 2 or 3 party politics, and how they don't think that politicians do have the answers. And I think for people in Parliament and for Westminster at large, that sense of apathy and almost nihilism out there does seem stronger than it's been for quite some time.
And Jim, just very quickly, should we be concerned about the sharp increase in postal votes in Rochdale?
I think that will be one, to be honest, that will be one for the experts to look into if there have been complaints about it. That's not one for me to ruminate about on daytime TV until facts are known about that kind of thing.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for your time. Jim Pickard, Deputy Political Editor at the Financial Times. Great to speak to you. Now, new research has revealed a shocking 1 billion people are obese worldwide. Are the junk food giants to blame? Should they be taxed and banned out of our shops? Or are global health standards just slipping? I'll be joined shortly by a nutrition expert. That's after your headlines with Sat.
Emily, thanks very much. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's just gone 2:30, and we start by recapping the news just breaking in the last half hour or so that it has now been confirmed the son-in-law of Prince Michael of Kent died from a traumatic head wound. Thomas Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds on the 25th of February, where he was later found dead in an outbuilding by emergency services. The inquest today at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court heard a gun was recovered from the scene, but police say they are satisfied the death is not suspicious. Rishi Sunak has said the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has also described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who they say brings division and hate to every place he has ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented programmes on television for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. The cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant that's sent to the African nation. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. And there'll also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated there, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs. The Prime Minister, though, has said that the plan is vital to clamp down on illegal migration. And as we've heard today, the cost of a postage stamp is going up again as the Royal Mail rises prices amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class stamps are also going up by the same amount, 10 pence, to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. The increase comes after warnings by the troubled delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which it says is pushing up its costs. Those are the headlines. For more, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Marnie says being sexy in business is entirely possible and maybe even better.
Well, Marnie, this is something I say is true. I've had to live with this for quite a long time. And I think you can do both. Now, tell me, it's lovely to see you, first of all.
Thank you for having me.
In all your gorgeousness. And you're telling me that that often is regarded as something derogatory or something to hold you back. Is that right?
It's just this really unfair thing, this really unfair narrative that women can't do both. Even men can do it. As you know, Eamon, you can do it. You can do it all. And I just think, you know, women are so multifaceted. They can be mothers, they can be sexy, they can be businesswomen, they can be silly, they can be all these different dimensions. And this press push that we have to limit ourselves to one category is just unfair.
But do you think that is where some people may be wrong-footed or go wrong to underestimate you?
Exactly. There is that saying, disarm with charm. So, you know, that there is that idea that people do look at someone who cares about how they look, who's perhaps a bit feminine, and underestimate them. But hopefully I proved that wasn't the case in the boardroom.
And thank goodness for Karen Brady. She's definitely upped the glam stakes on the show. And if anybody can prove that you can be sexy and successful in business, I suppose it's her, really. But where do you think most of the criticism comes from? Because I have to say, hard to believe, but when I was younger, I certainly got a bit of this at my old employer, being told that I had to dress a certain way, not to be too sexy, which I found hugely
out, you were told this by women.
I was told this by a female boss who didn't like me wearing zips on the back of my dress. Not just me, but some of the other presenters there. And I took such offence. I felt like she thought that I was some sort of, I don't know what. Do you take offence when people are criticising you that, you know, in some way they think you're, I don't know?
There's just no right answer. And as you said, I think Karen Brady is doing an excellent job at leading the charge that you can be glamorous and get the job done.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, it's 2:39. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Now, there's been shocking new analysis revealed today that more than 1 billion people are obese, with 1 in 8 of the population in the entire world affected. Now, around 159 million children and 879 million adults have a weight that is so high relative to their height that it classifies them as obese. So joining me now in the studio to discuss this is consumer good expert and nutritionist Monica Price. Monica, does this surprise you that 1 in 8 of the entire population of the world is now obese?
No, it doesn't. I'd like to say it does, but unfortunately it doesn't. You know, we've got 16.8 million people now from this data. They've been classed as obese. And, you know, I was just discussing with you, 67 million people in the UK. That is almost a quarter now of the population of the UK that are now classed as obese. What was staggering was that, you know, that we just keep going up. Between 1990 and 2022, the rates of obesity have quadrupled between children and adolescents, which I find quite shocking, and almost doubled, in fact, more than doubled, in adults alone. So we're just... You know, we've got this health campaign, we're saturated with this is what you should be eating, and it just doesn't seem to be going in, Emily. We're just not finding any kind of common ground here.
No, it's true. I'm sure most people have at least one point in their life tried a fad diet.
Absolutely,
and it may work for a couple of months even, and then it goes a bit pear-shaped.
It does.
But lots of people, lots of the public health lobby will say, We need to ban certain foods. We need to ban advertisements. We need to ban junk food from schools, from hospitals, from workplaces, from your own home even. And we need to tax all these big businesses more who sell us this junk food. Are you on that side of things, or are you more anti-nanny state?
Yeah, no, I don't. Those sort of things, you can't tell somebody what they can eat and what they can't eat. But what we can do is educate. I think if you educate that person, and then that empowers them to make informed choices. So if you say to them, look, this is the sort of diet that's going to make you feel really good. It's going to give you lots of energy. You're going to have a long life. We're going to lower our risk of diabetes, lower our risk of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, all these common things that come along with a bad diet. If you educate that person, then they make that informed choice.
Isn't the problem, though, that we know what's bad for us? We know what's bad for us, but particularly when you get to a certain age, the pounds start piling on, and then you think, oh, well, this is me. You know, this is me. Yes, I'm a bit chubby, but
what the heck? Yes,
what's the heck? What the heck?
The problem is with that is that if you're living well with that and you still wake up, the way I look at it is if you still wake up and you've got lots of energy, you know, you feel good about yourself, you're happy in your own skin, then, you know, you need to be able to say that to yourself. But if you're somebody who's waking up that's having to take medication every day because they've got high blood pressure, if you're somebody that's having to struggle with the risk of having diabetes or having some kind of heart disease, then that's the time to say, I need to stop, take stock of what I'm doing with my life and look at my diet and how I can eat it and you know, what food I can eat. That's where I think education is really important. We all like our chocolate cake. I like my chocolate cake, but it's about having everything in moderation. It's that old-fashioned saying of everything in moderation, but really it works.
Do you know what? This type of discussion always divides our viewers and listeners.
It does.
So some people are furious at being nagged over their weight. Fair enough, to be honest. Most people know if they're overweight and they just haven't done anything about it yet.
Exactly.
Others get in touch and say, well, actually, I've got this or that issue that is preventing me from being able to lose weight, and I put on weight much more easily than others. And then we've got another cohort of people who say it's all personal responsibility. Get off your backside, stop eating junk food, and, you know, lose the weight, because otherwise you're going to die prematurely, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Well, you see, everybody's got their own views, but as somebody who's a nutritionist, and so people come to me because they need help, and often they will come to a nutritionist because they've tried everything. They've tried the fad diets, you know, they've done the sort of 5-2, they've done everything, and in the end they think, what am I doing? You know, I go into the gym, you know, I'm doing all this exercise, nothing's working. And again, it's about having that understanding about what the food's doing to your body. And every diet is different. I don't believe in these fad diets, because what's good for one person, what would be good for you, wouldn't be good for me. And, you know, and that's the way it is with individuals. So you have to take, but you do have to take responsibility.
Yes.
You're the one that puts the food into your mouth.
That is true. Unless it's forced out your throat, then, you know, it is up to you. Thank you very much, Monica. Great to speak to you about this. Monica Price, consumer good expert and, of course, a nutritionist. Let me know what you make of that. Whose fault is it that we're getting more fat? Do we live in an obesogenic environment, or is it all about personal responsibility? If you're fat, is it your fault? Let me know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.com. But coming up, it's revealed that Thomas Kingston, the husband of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's daughter, Lady Gabriella Kingston, died from a traumatic head wound. We'll have the very latest after this very short break.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Welcome to the show. Superb stuff, great footage. So you're right in the thick of it there. What's the mood on the ground?
Well, I've left there now. I've actually now come to that EU Council summit that I was talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors, sort of 3 abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, you know, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures. Endless red tape, as Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain. They've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 2:47. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Now to the breaking news that Thomas Kingston, the husband of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's daughter, Lady Gabriella Kingston, died from a traumatic head wound, and a gun was found near to his body in an outbuilding at his parents' home in the Cotswolds. An inquest opening at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court has heard. Well, joining me to discuss this is royal correspondent and writer Michael Cole. Shocking news there.
Emily, terrible news, very, very sad news. And our thoughts must be for Ella, Lady Ella, a charming woman, only 42 and a widow. And now to hear this terrible news about her handsome, charismatic husband dead at 45. I met her at her father's in 2022 at her father's birthday party at Kensington Palace, and she was utterly charming. There you see them on their wedding day, and it was only just 4 years ago that they got married. The husband himself was a very successful man, a financier, asset management, but earlier in his career he'd been out in Iraq for 3 years, working for conflict resolution, working as a hostage negotiator, trying to bring peace through the Anglican Church in Baghdad. Whether that plays any part in what has happened, we will not know until the coroner has conducted the inquest, and that inquest will be there to find out how Thomas Kingston came about his death, to use the archaic language of the courts. Very sad day. I know from Princess Michael of Kent, his mother-in-law, how much they liked him and how much they thought of him. So very, very sad. But collectively, perhaps on your behalf and the viewers' behalf, I could send our condolences to Lady Ella, who we see there on a very happy day of her wedding.
So all we know so far is that Thomas Kingston was found dead at his parents' home in a Cotswolds village, suffered a catastrophic head injury, and a gun was found close to his body. That's all we know at the moment.
That is all we could decently know at the moment. It's the coroner's job whenever there's an unexpected or sudden death, to carry out an inquest. It's the oldest office of the law in this country, meaning the Crown's officer, and he will look into that and he will find out the circumstances and he will deliver his verdict with or without a jury. It will be up to him to decide whether he needs a jury. But the police said at the time that no other person was being looked for and that there was no ongoing investigation as such. So very, very sad. And when you see those pictures, it makes it even more poignant, doesn't it, Emily? I mean, quite awful, quite
Beautiful
awful.
wedding.
And of course, a very bad time for the royal family. I mean, they've had a week of it, lots of news, but none of it good, Emily.
Well, Michael, I'd like to ask you about that. Lots has been written and speculated about the Princess Catherine of Wales, and we were told that we weren't going to see her till the Easter. She had this abdominal surgery. Then the Prince didn't turn up or cancelled at very late notice from the memorial service of his godfather. There's been so much speculation now about the Princess.
I'm afraid when there is a void, there's always speculation, and I'm afraid some of that void, that vacuum, is filled with rubbish very, very rapidly on social networks and elsewhere. Of course, it wasn't a minor matter. It was nothing trivial. She was in hospital, and there we see her in happier days, for 13 nights. They don't keep you in hospital in the London clinic for 13 nights if it's nothing small. But it's interesting, Kensington Palace has issued a statement, apart from saying that she's getting on very well, the recovery is continuing. They issued a statement which I shall read. It says that they hope the Princess says that she hopes the public will understand her desire to maintain as much normality for her children as possible and her wish that her personal medical information remains private. Well, of course, we must respect that. I think what we can say is that she's been at Adelaide Cottage in Windsor Great Park, but she's also been up to Anmer Hall in North Norfolk on the Sandringham estate. So she's obviously ambulatory. She's able to get around. I think what that statement means is that she doesn't want her children to be subjected to kids in the school playground saying, "Why, what's wrong with your mum?" You know, and then news of this leaking out. Obviously, it's a problem.
Michael, sorry, we're just running out of time, but I'd like to ask you one more question. Do you think the royal family should tell us more about Catherine's condition to stop this speculation, or do you think they've said enough now?
No, I think a little bit more candour would be helpful, because there's a lot of speculation about why, at the very last minute, Prince William was a no-show at the memorial service for his godfather and his cousin, ex-King Constantine of Greece. That has not been explained, and Kensington Palace, hasn't really actually dismissed completely the fact that it may have had something to do with Catherine. I think on this occasion, a little bit more guidance, because rumour is a lying jade, and we do not wish to have that to happen, because rumour and speculation are very undesirable at this particular time. A little bit of guidance would be helpful. We don't want to know all the details. Of course, the Princess of Wales is entitled to her privacy like every other woman, but a little guidance would be a good idea.
Difficult, isn't it? You give people a little bit of information, then, of course, they always want to know more. Thank you very much indeed, Michael Cole. Thank you for your time. That's it for me today. Thank you for keeping your views coming through the entire show. But up next, it's Martin Dobney. Martin, what is coming up on your show?
Well, yesterday, Rishi Sunak said the mob had taken over the streets. Is the mob now taking over politics? Of course, that's George Galloway. Rwanda, 590 million quid, but that's only the same as 39 days in asylum hotels. Maybe it's good value after all. All that kind of loads more. But first, here's your latest weather forecast.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. The rest of the day will remain cold wherever you are. There's a further risk of rain, showers and some hill snow. Got low pressure still in charge. That's got cold air wrapped around it as well as these occluded fronts. And that's where the focus for the most persistent rain will continue to be. That area will push into more southern areas of Scotland through this evening and then into northern Scotland later on tonight. So we could see snow falling above around 150 to 200 metres. Further south, it should stay drier for a time this evening, but overnight this more persistent area of rain will push in to the south coast and then up towards the Midlands. That brings a risk of snow to some lower levels by tomorrow morning. So it will be a cold start to the weekend wherever you are, and it will remain quite overcast and wet through much of the day for central areas of England as well as northern areas of England later on by mid-morning. Further south and west, we'll see a mix of sunshine and showers, but those showers bring a risk of heavy downpours as well as some hail and further hill snow. So another quite unsettled and cold feeling day to come through tomorrow. Sunday is looking much drier on the whole. There's still a risk of showers, particularly across the south as well as the far north, but many areas should see a much drier day with a greater chance of some sunshine. And it won't feel too bad in the sunshine. We are now into meteorological spring, but there is some further rain to move into the southwest later on Monday. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers.